Hello, I see people joining. We're going to just give it a couple of minutes after the start time here. So if you can just hang tight, we'll just wait just a bit. Welcome to those who are joining. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes here. I'm going to start maybe 3 minutes after the start time to give a couple of more people a chance to join. I see some familiar names joining. So hello, everyone who I do know, and many new names as well. Again, we're going to start just a minute after, maybe one more minute, and then we'll go ahead. But hello to the familiar names out there. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Offshore Wind, New Developments and Lessons Learned, as it's entitled. My name is Lori Anaconzo. I'm the Vice Chair of the Energy Task Force of the Convention of Migratory Species, who is hosting this event. And I'm also the Global Biodiversity Lead of the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group. I'll be facilitating this webinar today with the help of Rhiannon Nevin, who is the Global Change Policy Officer and ETF Coordinator with BirdLife International, and also with Ivan Ramirez, who is the Head of Unit of Conservation with the Convention of Migratory Species. Rhiannon, if you could share my slide. There we go. So it's been estimated that 1,400 gigawatts of offshore wind is needed by 2050 to deliver the energy transition and limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And the graphic that you're looking at here is taken from the World Bank Group's Global Wind Atlas, and it shows the average wind speed, offshore wind speeds across the globe, where wind speeds are greater than 7 meters per second. Now, that graphic there is just showing technical potential. So there's obviously many other things that would be factored in, but alone, that is impressive. 70,000 gigawatts available. 19 countries globally are now operating offshore wind, with around half of those being in China. 22% in the UK, and the remaining quarter mostly found across Europe. but that is starting to change. 18 other countries are starting to develop their offshore wind resources, including across the Americas and South Asia. So while the world is talking, at least the biodiversity space, we're all talking nature positive, but many of these newer countries in the mix are still struggling with the basics. A lot will need to be done to ensure the sustainable rollout of the offshore wind sector globally. Further research is needed on the effects and the impacts of offshore wind. New tools and technologies will be required, legislation and regulations to be developed, and most importantly, knowledge exchange, especially between developed and developing or emerging market countries. The CMS Energy Taskforce seeks to be one actor in that space. It provides a platform for collaboration and knowledge exchange. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Yvonne, who is going to say a few words about the CMS and its objectives before we move on to our webinar. Over to you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Laurie. Hopefully you can all hear me well. Hello to all of you. And thank you for joining us today in this very interesting webinar focused on offshore wind energy and biodiversity. I won't have any slides. I will just go quickly through a bit of history of the CMS, and again, just to welcome you all to this very exciting webinar. As Laurie mentioned, my name is Ivan Ramirez. I am the head of the avian units at the CMS. And just to give you some information, the Energy Task Force is a multi-stakeholder platform developed under the umbrella of the CMS, and our secretariat hired BirdLife International as the implementing partner responsible for the coordination. As I said, I'm really happy to celebrate this webinar. I believe that we have quite a large number of participants, and I think this is the right moment to reflect about the challenges, but also the opportunities that offshore wind power represents globally. The CMS has now 133 parties, that is 132 countries plus the European Union. But also under the umbrella of the CMS, we have very relevant international agreements that are, I think, important for offshore wind energy, specifically Eurobats, but also the Raptors MOU and AIWA. The Energy Task Force was established in 2016, and we have continuously grown in membership, not just by adding parties, but also multilateral environmental agreements such as CBD or Ramsar. But also organizations such as the World Bank or the Renewable Grid Initiative, academia, NGOs, etc. As our speakers will surely say today, and according to the offshore wind outlook, the offshore market is supposed to increase tenfold by 2050. And with this increase in mind, the ETF really wants to offer a positive vision, one that ensures best practice is shared globally, one that really makes all players to work together to identify gaps, but also opportunities. And also, and I think it's very important to mention that this is not just about impacts to birds, but actually to any migratory species. And with that respect, I'm really happy to see that today in our webinar, we have our colleagues from the aquatic team also giving an overview on the impacts of marine mammals. So with that in mind, I really look forward for a really positive debate. Look forward to hearing from all the presentations, and over to you, Laurie.
Good. Thank you so much, Yvonne, and to the CMS ETF for hosting this event. So we have an interesting lineup here. We'll be kicking off with RSPB's landmark report, Powering Healthy Seas, Accelerating Nature Positive Offshore Wind. We'll hear from BirdLife and their AV-STEP tool, which was developed with the Asian Development Bank. I'm really looking forward to this one, Offshore Wind and Cetaceans, Escoban sites, also presented from CMS teams. And we'll also hear from the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. This is called Ocean, and it's the role of NGOs in the space. And we're very lucky to have the Spanish Wind Association speaking about advancing nature-safe renewable wind in Spain. And I'll also be showing up there. I'll be speaking on the World Bank Group's environmental and social framework for offshore wind spatial planning. But for now, I'll be turning it over to Samuel Robo, who's a Marine Policy Officer with the RSPB.
Thank you, Laurie. I'm just going to I'll share my screen, and we can get started on our new fancy report. Hopefully everyone can see that, and do flag if it's not showing, but
We can see it, Samuel. We're good.
super, thank you. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me here and this opportunity to talk about this. So as Laurie introduced, my name is Samuel Robels. I'm a Marine Policy Officer working specifically on offshore wind for the RSPB. And about 2 months ago now, we released our Powering Healthy Seas report, and it set out a series of recommendations, not only from a nature protection perspective on offshore wind, but also on how offshore wind can be used as this catalyst for change and this driver for kind of nature positive expansion of offshore wind. I understand that many of us are aware of where we're at the moment with our season, but I think it's important to kind of set the scene a little bit still on where our seabirds are at, what state our seas are in. It's often the context that we say they're in a poor state, but actually how important that from a UK perspective our seas are for seabirds on the global scene is such an important value that I'm always keen to reiterate. If you look at the size of the UK, we have an incredibly large marine space for the size of our landmass. 3/4 of the UK is sea, and we're a small island. It sometimes feels like we're a little bit bigger than we are, but we are a small landmass and we're a small island. The fact that we have globally important numbers of seabirds on this landmass kind of starts to demonstrate the importance that our seas have on the wider scene of things. Each summer we have nearly 8 million seabirds across 25 different species using our waters alone. Of those seabirds, we have 1/10 of the world's puffins, over almost 50% of the world's northern gannets, and over 90% of the Manx shearwaters. There is an enormous importance on our seas for the global health of seabirds. Things like the State Nature Report, Conservation Science Team, seabird censuses, they all feed into what we call good environmental status, which forms part of, in the UK Marine Strategy. This is demonstrating that at a government level, it is recognised that we are failing on good environmental status for seabirds, and is actually the only factor which is not only failing, but it's actually moving away from achieving good environmental status. Of those 25 breeding seabirds, only one species is not on the amber or red list for birds of conservation concern in the UK. We've seen declines across all 4 countries of 25% since the 1980s. And in Scotland, which we consider one of our strongholds of seabirds, the majority of our species can be found up there. That decline is as much as 49%. So it's really starting to build this picture of the state of our seas. And we've seen this kind of pattern across the UK of special protection areas, and that network being incomplete between foraging areas out at sea, nesting areas on land. These marine protected area habitats are just not protected to the level that is required. We have 30% of marine protected areas on our seas, but it's only something around 8% of those which are considered to actually be properly protected against harmful activities. We consider seabirds to be indicator species. So they demonstrate that they are failing on the health of our seas. It's not just along this taxonomic group. They are under pressure, and they've been under pressure, and this is not a new thing. We've had decades of human activity through development and overexploitation, overfishing, unsustainable fisheries, invasive non-native mammals having an impact as well. And this legacy of human impact. Importantly, and especially kind of in the context of renewables, is important to recognize that climate change is also a significant threat to seabirds. Through increased storminess happening at sensitive times of year with chicks on exposed raw cliff faces, sea level rise impacting our coastal habitats, food webs. Importantly, you're getting this mismatch in the food chain, and it's really starting to have that more and more this devastating impact, particularly on prey availability, and that's nesting habitat. And not to kind of, I appreciate that this is kind of very starting on the negative foot, but we all have importantly seen the devastating impact of avian influenza, avian flu this year, which is kind of streaming through our seabird colonies at a rate that we have never before witnessed. All of these pressures plus avian flu is causing a real concern, and it is genuinely scary for our seabirds at the moment. What we must not forget is these are our ally in our fight on climate change. We can roll out as much offshore wind and renewable technology as we like, but if we do not have a healthy ecosystem to back that up, it will not be successful in mitigating climate change. So we need offshore wind. It is adding to this legacy of human impacts. And what we're seeing is this incredibly busy sea. We are wanting to expand a huge amount of offshore wind. But as we kind of said, it is 100% necessary. There is no kind of question on that. We need to roll out renewable technology at a massive scale. We need to shift away from fossil fuels at a rate that has never been seen before. This is a renewable energy revolution at the moment. It's a low-cost technology, and it's proven, and it is one of the few that can be rolled out on the scale that is required. We've got energy security crisis, we've got cost of living crisis, plus the need to shift away from fossil fuels. So the need to scale up offshore wind is essential. And that is something that we are, as an NGO sector generally, and especially from the RSPB, are 100% supportive of. But what we need to remember here is that this is a dual nature and climate emergency. Dealing with this as such in isolated approaches, isolated in the nature emergency, isolated in the climate emergency, does not work. They are integrated, they are intrinsic to one another, and we need to deal with them in that case. And as kind of Ivan had mentioned as well at the beginning, is there is fantastic opportunity with offshore wind and renewables to do this. There is a potential for offshore wind to drive this ambition, drive this total shift in the way that we manage our seas for this ocean recovery and building in that resilience. And this can be that catalyst for that change. What's lacked so far has been the spatial context, and the ecological impacts haven't been addressed early enough in the case of developing wind farms. And this has led us to the case we're at in the North Sea at the moment, where we have a legacy of impacts. It's only been recently that these ecological impacts have been recognized on a government level. And the impacts on poor planning and poor policy frameworks has kind of developed these ecological impacts and led to challenges in compensation and various areas of where we're at now. And there is a fantastic opportunity for lessons learned. And I'm trying to kind of not go too much into the details of compensation, because it is a hot topic and there are many different variables depending on where we're at and which country we're in. But at the end of the day, it is compensation. We need to, at first, avoid and then mitigate those ecological impacts. And this is the situation we're at now. This is what brings us to Powering Healthy Seas. So Powering Healthy Seas was meant to be this collaborative solutions-focused report. As I think I've just proven, NGOs, we're very good at telling us how bad the state of our seas are and what situation our seabirds are in. That is where we're comfortable. What we need to be at the moment is in this solutions-focused component. We need to be driving forward in how we can shift out of this. And that was where Powering Healthy Seas report came in. We managed to get a huge amount of support from not only England or Scotland, but actually all 4 countries support. We had international support, and thanks to the team at BirdLife as well, and Fauna and Flora International. We had various seabird groups, but also the whale and dolphin conservation group signing up, showing the support for cetaceans. It kind of demonstrates the breadth that offshore wind is taking. And as Laurie demonstrated that map of the amount of countries that are developing offshore winds, and the state that the UK is in that scene demonstrates the need to be looking at this urgently. And we have this solutions focus. We're calling for a new approach. And what I'll go into shortly as well is the recommendations that we have made for not only a nature protection in terms of offshore wind sector itself, but a wider suite of measures that can look at a nature positive outcome for our seas and bringing in more on a seabird focus, but on the wider frame of things. Because as we say, this is a dual emergency and it needs to be tackled as such. So nature protection. This was one of the chapters in the report focused on the offshore wind sector itself and how nature protection can form part of the process of developing offshore wind. Many of the barriers to expansion of offshore wind have been rooted in the planning systems and the failure to keep pace with not only the evolution of offshore wind as a technology. We go back 10, 15 years, the wind turbines have not only increased in size, but increased in efficiency and the development process and the the construction process as well is improving. Some of these wind turbines now out at sea, they are hitting 350 meters from bottom to top with a rotor diameter of 300 meters. They are enormous. But the failure to keep pace with that, or indeed with the pace of the nature and climate emergency, has led to a lot of these barriers and a lot of these challenges. And these challenges are hindering the elements of actually getting offshore wind operational. It's not about just putting turbines in the water. You've got market readiness in terms of the supply chains, how you can find the materials to construct the turbines in the first place, research vessels, construction vessels, staffing, but also the grid connections. We cannot roll out this much offshore wind if our grids are not ready to deal with the energy coming from offshore. So there is much to gain across the sector by updating these planning and policy frameworks. And the following recommendations here are aimed at taking account of nature and using that driver to update these planning and policy frameworks in a scale that is not yet happening on the UK. Some of these are attempting to form and taking place, but not at the scale required. So we need a robust evidence base. We need to know more about what is happening in our seas. Industry are out there, industry are in our waters building these wind turbines. We need to be able to collaborate on this, share data, share knowledge, and build this robust evidence base. And this will help us to inform the siting of new offshore wind farms in what we consider to be less sensitive areas. And that will help to start avoiding these risks. But the backing that is required for that is this robust evidence base. We need to be looking at country level marine plans. So where we have this developments happening in all of our seas, we need to be looking at this sectorally on an offshore wind basis, but also across multiple sectors. In certain countries in the UK here, we're looking at, in Scotland, you have a sectoral marine plan. We're looking for a similar thing in England, where we are mapping out our seas on a sectoral level. In Wales, we're looking to go that one step further as we're in a different stage with development, and we're wanting it to be holistically across multiple sectors, and with the intention of this taking place across the entirety of the UK. And this is something that can be really developed and have these lessons learned and applied globally to demonstrate how marine plans could be used to facilitate a lot of this happening. We need to look at cumulative impact assessments. Each wind farm itself can have its own impacts on certain seabird populations, certain species. They all interact in different ways, behave and forage in different ways. But multiple wind farms will have cumulative impacts, and it's this which is not being assessed at the appropriate level. We do not understand how much each wind farm is adding to the impacts being caused. We need to be looking at industry standards. So this comes through the mitigation side of things, how we can design our turbines in a way which helps mitigate damage through collision risk, displacement risk. And we need the industry standards to back that up and allow industry to develop in that way. But we need to see that ambition from industry as well in looking to explore these new areas. As we kind of develop a lot of these, as we build the evidence, as we create these mitigation techniques and these new innovative ideas, we need adaptive management. We need to be flexible in how we deal with this. If new evidence comes forward that demonstrates that actually this might not be the best way in one instance, we need to be flexible in our policy framework to adapt to that, and the planning framework to adapt to these changes and shift as we learn more and as we grow more. And we need to do that collectively, not only just from an NGO sector, but we need to be working with industry and transmission system operators across the board to be able to adapt to this. What's coming across a lot, particularly in England at the moment, but it seems to be growing and growing, is this idea of strategic compensation. And that is where, from a seabird perspective, it is very difficult to compensate for damage caused by a wind turbine, by a wind farm at that level. Seabirds are very mobile species. They move across geographical, political borders. They use multiple foraging areas. We need to be thinking about this strategically. It is very difficult to compensate for damage on one wind farm for one colony. We need to look at the wider suite of things. And this is a very hot topic and a complicated topic at that, which is why I'm sort of kind of avoiding not going into too much detail, because I really could spend the next, day and a half talking about that one. And lastly, and I understand that I have rattled through these, is the marine net gain system. And that needs to be clear that it is not being conflated with strategic compensation. It is not being conflated with a nature positive approach as well. Marine net gain needs to have a robust framework to enable development action to enhance nature. And that needs to sit across the board. And it is definitely an additional component to this. So this is what brings us to this second component, which is nature positive. So nature positive is this, it's a global ambition and drive that was kind of put together with governments, conservation organizations, including BirdLife, where they look at all sectors with the goal of a world richer in biodiversity and thriving economies. So it comes from an economic and business approach for investment into nature. We need to act on these challenges of harnessing the ambition of nature positive, and it's using this kind of ambition and this catalyst for change that we can have this truly transformative energy transition. And nature positive is the idea that by 2030 we'll be net positive, and that'll be driving us on this road to recovery. At the RSPB, we've been developing our nature positive definition and opinion on offshore wind. And it's this tricky balance between not getting too bogged down in the definitions and the wording of things, and actually, you know, we need to start seeing action in this space. But nature positive is a global action. It is an entity in itself. It is not a term which can be just applied to have, you know, a nature positive wind turbine, because at the end of the day, putting a giant metal fan in the sea, it's hard to be good for nature, but there are methods around that we can approach it that really can be and can drive this recovery. So nature positive in the case of offshore wind is industry and government-led action to restore resilient seas, going above and beyond halting nature loss as part of this, part of the UK's renewable energy transition. And I think the key things to pull apart here are industry and government-led, and going above and beyond. So this requires a dual approach from not only the industry standards, but really we need to see that industry can help develop this with us and drive that ambition to have this shift in government-led approach. It needs to come from that level if we are to be truly transformative, and for this to work on the scale that is required, and to go above and beyond. It needs to go to the next step. It is not about halting nature loss. We're at a state in our seas where they are at a very poor level. We need to halt that loss, and then we need to go above and beyond and restore these resilient seas that we once had in our waters. So in terms of what this means, what we look at here is from a seabird lens, and that can be applied across our seas, because as we were saying, seabirds are this indicator species. They are mobile, they work across multiple marine areas. So what we look at in terms of nature positive and offshore wind is a strategic and holistic marine spatial plan. So this is something that I was mentioning before and alluded to between the country level plans. But this will provide clarity for marine users across the breadth of our seas, kind of facilitating that development alongside the achievement of good environmental status, giving space for development, space for fishing communities, space for shipping routes, and space, importantly, for nature in that area as well, and having enough protection in place. In the UK, we're in a position where something that we call for strongly is the closure of industrial sand eel fisheries. Sand eel are forage fish. They're the classic. I mean, here's a puffin here with sand eels in its mouth. They're the fish that you see in the face of puffins. Closing the industrial sand eel fleets in the UK, we're in a position through Brexit that is possible to call for this, could be enormous for our seabirds. And that can be one of these pillars for seabird survival, in that they need more food, they need safer places to feed and safer places to nest. Closure of that sand eel fishery is going to be vital for that. Minimize and eliminate bycatch. Bycatch is, so that's the accidental mortality of seabirds in fishing gear. The amazing thing about bycatch is it is fixable. If you look at cases in South Africa and Namibia, where the albatross Taskforce teams, BirdLife and RSPB collaboration, have reduced bycatch of albatross and seabirds by 98%. It is an incredibly successful mitigation measure when implemented, and we need to see that implemented in UK waters, because we are not immune to the impacts of bycatch. It happens to our seabirds as well. Marine protected areas, a complete and actual blue protection. At the moment, they are essentially paper parks. They're areas which do not see the full protection, and we need to see this efficiency across the board and this network of completed marine protected areas. And then on land as well, we have the biosecurity programs. On land, one of the biggest threats to seabirds are invasive species. Again, it is another fantastic opportunity to be successful in mitigating threats. And a UK-wide or a nationwide implementation of biosecurity measures can be a really successful way of doing that and protecting our seabirds across the board in their nesting habitats. So in summary, and it's a bit cliche, but we do need to change today to power tomorrow. Offshore wind is coming quickly. We have targets for 2030 where we need to see a 5-fold increase in where we currently are in the next 8 years. By 2050, we need to be at a position where we are 10 times the offshore wind capacity that we're at the moment. We need to see changes in the planning and policy frameworks today in order to reach that point in the future. This is a window of opportunity. It is our time at the moment to do this. We have the capability. We've never before had this information, this much knowledge to do it. And this is our opportunity to really act now and collaborate on this and see those changes that we need. I appreciate that I did whistle through that, and that was 20 minutes on the nose. So if, yeah, any questions, please, I'll be more than happy to answer them, or feel free to contact in the future. But thank you very much for listening. And that was our Powering Healthy Seas report. Great.
Thank you so much, Samuel. I'm just noticing, sorry to check in here. Rhiannon, I don't think my video's working. Okay, there we go. Sorry. Here I am. Anyway, thank you so much, Samuel. That was really wonderful. And I was going to ask questions, but there's so many that came in the chat that we're just going to go right to the chat. And I'm not going to, I think we will get to all of them. I'm not going to ask them in order, but let me start out with actually Robert Adamczak's question from EBRD, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And he asks a question that I think is on many of our minds. It's certainly on my mind. And that is, how do we differentiate between no net loss, which is, you know, what we were aiming for as far as kind of basic compliance, good international industry practice, and now nature positive. And I was glad you started out your presentation speaking about avoidance and mitigation. But from what I've seen in the market, others seen in the market, I feel like some industry and even banks, I have to say, are now kind of jumping on the nature positive bandwagon as if it's something different from basic good international industry practice that everyone was supposed to be doing in the first place. So how would you differentiate between kind of good international industry practice, mitigation, kind of what everyone should be doing, and now nature positive?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. And it's one that's quite tricky to unpack, because I think you're absolutely right in that we are in this, and through recent conferences and discussions, I'm starting to kind of build a picture in my own head. And this is why this might not come out in the most kind of succinct way, but it's something that's happening at the moment, and we're developing it as we go along. But do we need to be innovating and creating new phrases and new lovely, you know, nature positive is the hot topic at the moment. That's the word that everyone's using. And it does get to the point where you're like, does it matter kind of what each moment means? If we are creating the action necessary, then it is going to be benefiting nature as a whole. What I think nature positive is the difference between is that from our perspective, and this is what discussions we've been having, is nature positive looks at the wider frame of things on a more broader view from that one sector. So rather than looking at, and as an example from the industry at the moment, is that oyster restoration is something which is quite a talkative moment. It is something which seems to be being pushed forward as part of wind farm development. We can use oyster bed restoration as part of that development to kind of benefit that area and have that net gain. From our side of things, we are trying to work out how does that actually benefit the seabird cycle, and this is where we would see a nature positive side of things, looking at oyster restoration doesn't necessarily fit into nature positive. Nature positive would be looking at the wider frame of fisheries management, and whether that is not necessarily coming through the offshore wind sector driving that, but it is the government-led approach that is required as part of nature positive. And this is why I was trying to explain that you're not having like you can't necessarily have a turbine which is labeled nature positive. It is more of an approach than anything else. And I think that's this bigger difference between net loss, are these steps that kind of can be taken in certain areas in certain cases. Whereas nature positive is that wider suite of measures looking at what affects seabirds.
Okay, that would help answer Robert's question when it comes to what he did. He then asked, we won't go into it now, but what is compliance? What is above compliance? Compliance is largely for a project. And if you're saying nature positive is more sectoral, broad, multi-sectoral even, that certainly answers the question that would be above compliance. But we can talk about that for a while, but I have a lot of other questions. So let me go to an anonymous question, and I'll read it out to you. It says, Sam, some of these issues have been around for some time. We were wondering how to do cumulative impacts even 10 years ago for the offshore wind sector, and it seems like these issues are still a problem. What do you think have been the blockages in making progress on cumulative impact assessment?
Wow, they have been around for a while. I was going through some of our old office files the other day, back from before I was born, and some of the things we were calling on. I was like, we're still calling on that these days. I think it's a whole suite of measures. It was only until 2020 that it was recognized on a government level that wind farms are causing ecological impact. I think we are shifting, and it is not necessarily down to one thing, but I think as a sector from conservationists, but also I think whether it's down to publicity on the nature and climate emergency, through communication levels, through various teams, there is a growing awareness that nature is forming more part of this conversation. And I think that is what is feeding into the fact that just because something can be beneficial for climate doesn't mean that it isn't beneficial for something else or is beneficial for nature.
Okay.
And I think that recognition is enabling us to see that they are becoming more and more of the same thing.
Okay.
But it's only recent. It's 2 years since it was recognized.
Okay, so you're saying that could be the game changer. That certainly wasn't in place in the past, where you had such interlinkages between nature and climate.
And our evidence is growing, and we're understanding more and more about where our seabirds are outside of the breeding seasons and all sorts, and it's developing, and we're able to learn more from that.
Okay, so hopefully you who asked the question, anonymous attendee, as it said, that the blockages, I'm sure it could be many, but hopefully this nature climate linkage will somehow push those regionally or nationally to look at this more seriously. I'm going to jump to some really good questions here. So let's go to Sam. Hi, Sam. I'm glad you're here, first of all. And Sam Ralston Payton from South Africa. And her question is strategic compensation. So she says, strategic compensation implies that we are able to accurately predict and measure impacts. That will be challenging in offshore environments. And here's a very challenging question she asked. What do we need to put in place to achieve that? That's a biggie.
That is the $1 million question. And I think our favorite answer as the NGO is, I don't know. We don't know. We don't know what it looks like at the moment. We are, as an insight to internally, we are developing a team at the moment to look at strategic compensation, because we don't yet know across the sector what is the actual mechanism that can deliver it and what it looks like on the scale that is needed. So it's not a helpful answer, but we don't know, but it is something that is a lot of time and effort is going into, not only from our side, but it's something that industry are really looking at as well. I think the important thing with strategic compensation is what I kind of mentioned before, is that it is still compensation. It is still that area, which is meaning that we have residual impacts from where we haven't avoided, where we haven't mitigated, and this is what is left. And that's where we're trying to compensate. Whether that is done on a project level or strategic level, it is still compensation. What we need to be doing as we develop further, and it is only a case in England at the moment, so as we look to other countries, is we need to be in the first instance avoiding and mitigating. Then we can really start to develop the mechanisms for strategic compensation. But understandably, we need to be ready for when that happens. So that's why we're looking at it. The more brains, the better. So if you're starting to think about it, let us know. Let's kind of work collaboratively on this and work out how strategic compensation can be delivered.
Well, Sam's from the BirdLife International South Africa, so maybe she can reach out to you on that question.
Yeah.
And so I am going to ask one more, although I realize our time is up, but this is another really good question from, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the name, but it is it's actually two questions. So maybe if you can answer them very quickly, but the first one's near and dear to my heart. So thank you. It says, thank you for an interesting presentation, Samuel. 2 questions, notes. The first one is, do you feel that there is sufficient data science on the direct impact of offshore, direct impact of offshore wind on birds' collision risk he's talking about, both seabirds and other migratory species that migrate over the sea? I think he's specifically talking about collision risk. If offshore collision rates are equivalent to terrestrial rates, could nature positive ever be reached?
Okay, yes.
Good challenging question.
Nature positive can be reached because it has to be reached. If it doesn't, we lose our seabirds. It can be done. It requires the ambition to do that. And from an NGO sector, we have it. From what we're learning from the industry sector, they have it. And I think we can work here collaboratively to drive the government-led action that is going to require that as well. In terms of collision risk, we have a growing awareness, but the problem is a lot of it is what evidence we have is then applied to models to understand the collision risk of seabirds. There's a few papers coming out. Natural England have looked into this, where they've estimated that at the moment there is, I think it's 1,000, don't quote me, but 1,140 kittiwakes, for example, are at risk from collision in our wind farms. It depends on the species. Collision risk is primarily a concern for kittiwakes and gannets. Other species like puffins, red-throated diver are affected more by displacement. Then there's the land side of things, which is something that I was talking about last week. There are some evidence looking at that, but we need to be looking at, I think we need to take evidence where we've got migration routes, and we need to look at flight behavior, flight height, and start to overlay that map. And I think it's something that we can start to be looking at as we go forward. But as is always the case, we don't have the evidence.
No, we don't. And I just want to put a plug for Martin Perro's book. So I'll put that in the chat later, but it really goes over, I have it behind me here. I'll write it down, but it really goes over collision risk and bird to offshore wind. It's an extremely difficult topic from the environment. I actually wanted to read another part of his question, but it was removed. Anyway, I'm sorry, if there was a second part of your comment that you made that I thought was very relevant, but it was just removed. But I if I can remember what he was saying, it was really about that these are very sophisticated approaches that might work in the UK, and many other markets are just way far behind that. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in my and they're struggling just for looking at basic mitigation. Yeah. So we'll come back to that. And then Robert, I know you have your hand up, and I don't know if we're going to be able to get to you because there's one other person who also would like to speak. And Irina, we are already 3 minutes over time, but would you want to just unmute and ask your question directly to Samuel?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay. My question was about the net zero and offshore wind production, which is essential for the net zero, because it's always circulated in the public space and in the political documents and so on and so on. But what is about the production of the energy installations, the turbines themselves? Are they produced in a way that there are no impacts on nature? And I clarify because for production of the installation, we know we need resources, we need, and there is also some impact on nature, extracting resources, production of parts, transportation, etc. And I wonder if somebody calculated this already, how friendly is the production of the turbines and the facilities which are necessary for the energy production. Because on one hand, I more often meet the people who ask this question, because we have already examples in different approaches and so on, that, for instance, electricity cars, that everybody say, oh, it is good, it is good for nature and so on, but when you look behind the scene and so how this is produced and what kind of waste is after it, then you see that it is not exactly net zero. So my
Yes.
question was, if
Yes.
you have such information or
Yes, and Irina, just to get a sense of where you're from, because it would help. Where are you? Are you working for government or NGO sector?
no, I work for the Bulgarian Society for the Protection of Birds.
Okay.
I'm from Bulgaria.
I know you're doing great work in Bulgaria on the onshore wind sector, really some cutting edge stuff. So that is an excellent question. Irina's really questioning the whole assumption of the wind energy itself, and largely with respect to the supply chain, which is the biggest unanswered question right now. And I think IUCN is interested in exploring that in the future, Irina. Samuel, has RSPB done any thinking on this in terms of, I know it's a kind of, that's a bigger question for RSPB, but I'm aware of that, and any question, any thoughts on supply chain, and if not, feel free to pass that.
Yeah, no, we're certainly doing thinking on it. It's something that we're quite a small team that work on this, on the policy aspect that we do, and it's something that we are looking at, kind of trying to develop a lot more capacity in the space of, because I heard talk from IUCN actually last week about that, is that,
Yep.
I'll keep this brief, but we cannot, if we're being nature positive and we need to accelerate this, and we're looking at seabirds in our lens, we cannot accelerate it in a way that is increasing deforestation or aggregate extraction or mining in other countries around the globe to be able to meet the targets of production of offshore wind. But at the moment, the supply chain cannot deal with the ambition that is required. If you look at the North Sea, the three main developers that are constructing wind farms in the North Sea can only construct about 7 gigawatts a year at the moment on the supply chain and the market readiness that they've got. That needs to be about 20 gigawatts. So that needs serious attention through a supply chain area. And then I think as NGOs, we need to be looking at as like crucially as well on the global scene of where the supply chain comes into. So we are looking at it. It's a classic case of the capacity and to look at different areas of this. But it is something which is 100% on our radar, that we need to be working across. Carla's going to talk later about the Ocean Coalition, and it's something that we can discuss across all of that as well, because that's a really multinational, international approach.
Yep, Irina, you're hitting the nail on the head with that one, and I think I don't think we have the answers right now to your question, but I believe IUCN will start putting a piece of work together on that very topic. So we are going to go on to the next speaker, and I'm going to ask Robert. We're not going to take the question live now, because now we're almost 10 minutes over time. But could you put your thoughts, Robert, in Q&A and me on the chat at least, because I would like others to hear what you're saying. I have a sense I know what it is, and maybe we could come to you next at another point. At this point, I am going to turn over to Tris Ellenson. So there's a little change in the schedule, and Tris is Senior Conservation Scientist at BirdLife International, and he's going to be sharing their newly released tool, AV-Step. Over to you, Tris.
Yeah, hi there. Thanks, Laurie, and hi everyone. Good to have this opportunity to talk to you today. Just getting my screen ready. I hope you can all see this fine. Okay, great. Yeah. So hopefully you're all looking at the homepage of Avistep, which is the tool I'm going to talk about today. I don't have any slides to present. I'm going to try and demonstrate the tool live, which is always a slightly risky thing to do. So fingers crossed it all goes to plan. But Avistep stands for AVI for avian and STEP for sensitivity tool for energy planning. And also is meant to sort of allude to the fact that we see this as an important step in ensuring truly nature sensitive energy expansion. This is a tool that we developed thanks to the support of the Asian Development Bank. We launched it at their Asia Clean Energy Forum back in the middle of summer. It's been publicly available at avistep.birdlife.org since the start of August. And so this is what you'll see if you go to that homepage. There are a whole range of supplementary pages that explain about the tool and provide video tutorials on how to use the tool. Also, there's a technical manual there that includes all of the methodology. So hopefully what we've achieved with Avistep is a very kind of easy to use, intuitive interface. But behind that, there's actually quite a sophisticated methodology and a huge amount of data. So hopefully, so you can understand that better if we don't have time to go into all of it now, if you read that background document. Anyway, just to get started and show you how the tool works, we've developed, thanks to ADB, a methodology that we think is globally applicable, this online interface, which we now have in place. And we've developed our assessments, assessing avian sensitivity in a range of different energy infrastructures for 4 initial countries. These are 4 countries in Asia: India, Nepal, Thailand, and Vietnam, all of which are important countries for the Asian Development Bank in terms of their investment. Also important countries that have all seen issues around energy infrastructure and birds, and where this kind of tool will play a really important role in being able to ensure that there's a more nature-safe energy expansion in these countries. But this is really, a platform and a method now which we want to expand around the world. So talking with ADB, but with other partners in all parts of the world, we're now in discussions about adding additional countries and territories to this tool. So we hope very quickly in the next few months and years to really expand the tool around the globe, principally across Asia, Central Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and countries where there's potential for high risk for renewable expansion and wildlife, and also perhaps low regulatory frameworks that are already in place, and where this map can do a lot of good. So when you select a country, and we'll look at India to start with, you're given the opportunity of seeing the avian sensitivity in relation to a range of different types of energy infrastructure: on and offshore wind, solar photovoltaics, and power lines, both the medium voltage distribution lines and the high voltage transmission lines. And a different methodology is being used to assign the sensitivities for each of these different infrastructure types, which all impact birds in slightly different ways. Obviously, we're most interested in looking at the offshore wind map, but to start with, I may just start by showing the onshore wind map, because it'd be interesting to look at some of the differences in how we can go about assessing sensitivity on and offshore. So when you select your energy type, it then brings up the sensitivity map. So this is the sensitivity map for onshore wind in India. The sensitivity is divided into 4 categories of sensitivity: low, moderate, high, very high. The area within each of those categories is shown, as well as the percentage of the country. Obviously, not every area will be suitable for wind energy. Most important is to have sufficient wind speed. For onshore winds, that's typically thought to be having wind speeds of 5 meters per second or greater. So what we've also done is we've modeled those areas that meet that threshold, and so you can take out those areas that don't. So you can see large areas of North and Northeast India don't have sufficient winds to be able to sustain commercial wind development. So we can take those areas out of the map, and the numbers we assess. So you can see the amount of area that falls within each of the areas of sensitivity in just those areas which have suitable wind speed. And so you can see that for across the whole of India, there's something like 64% of India that has suitable wind is of low or moderate sensitivity to birds. So there does seem to be a huge potential in India to develop onshore wind and to do so away from areas where there'll be really high impact on birds. And you can zoom into a particular state or province, in this case, the Indian state of Maharashtra. And again, the figures adjust. You can see in Maharashtra, there's actually nearer 70% is low or moderate. So great deal of potential, it would seem, for wind to be developed here. When you zoom in, you can see the scale at which we've carried out these analyses. So we've carried out these analyses at a really fine scale. Each of these grid cells is 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. So a very kind of fine resolution and appropriate resolution for the size of most wind and solar developments. And you can zoom in on those and look at a particular grid cell and see why it falls into the category of sensitivity that it does. So I've zoomed in on this very high sensitive 5 by 5 grid cell, and it's just pulling up the assessment here that tells me all the contributing factors that make this cell so sensitive. So this area is so sensitive because it falls within a World Heritage Site, a national park, an important bird area. It also we believe that it'll be 51 sensitive species of bird species that have a sensitivity to wind farms. They're ordered here in terms of their sensitivity. So the highest scoring species in terms of their sensitivity being white rump vulture and Indian vulture, followed by Egyptian vulture, Indian spotted eagle and tawny eagle, going right down to those that have lower sensitivity scores. And we've also assessed all of the birds in terms of how likely it is that the species occurs there. So there's an occurrence certainty score. So a score very high here means that these species, not only is more than 50% of this grid square the preferred habitat type for this species, but also we have observational records that put the species within this grid square. For those species that have a high certainty, less than 50% is the preferred habitat, but again, we have observational records that put the species in this site. Medium certainty is more than 50% of the area is the preferred habitat type, but we don't have any actual records of the species here. And low certainty is where the less than 50% is the preferred habitat type. And then finally, we've also taken high resolution satellite imagery, 100-meter accuracy resolution satellite imagery, being able to determine exactly what the composition of habitat types is within each square. And so this square is 72% forest and much of the rest is open water and wetlands. And therefore, the overall sensitivity score we give to this site is a combination of weighting those more biodiverse habitat types more. We then add up the sensitivity values for all of the sensitive species present there. And then actually the presence of having these sensitive protected areas or IBAs immediately puts this site in the highest sensitivity category. And so the intention very much with these maps is that now they can steer development towards parts of the country, where there's likely to be less impact. So we've seen very bad impacts in places like India and places like Western Rajasthan, which clearly shows up on our map as being highly sensitive. In future, hopefully development will be moved towards those areas with far less risk, and we'll see far less risk and far less impact on birds in India as a result of this map now being in place. And so to move to the offshore wind, which is obviously our main interest today, this is the map for the offshore area in India. And again, not everywhere will be windy enough to sustain offshore wind. Indeed, Laurie mentioned at the beginning, you need average annual wind speeds of 7 meters per second or greater at sea. So we've been able to remove those areas from the map, and almost immediately you can see in India, actually there's large areas that just aren't windy enough for offshore wind. So the areas really where offshore wind using current technology would be viable around Gujarat in the north and between Sri Lanka and India in the south, and also this area off the east coast. And immediately you can see that this area is likely to be a much safer area, particularly when floating wind technologies start to become available, and this would be an area that should perhaps be prioritized over these other areas. And again, you can zoom in to understand the assessment better down at its 5x5K resolution. You can then zoom in on a square as before and understand why the assessment is as it is. So this site has scored very high sensitivity, and why that is, it falls within. So one of the things we did, we identified all of the seabird colonies across all of the marine areas of these countries, and then for each of the breeding species at those seabird colonies, we established what was the known foraging radius from that colony of all of each of the different species present, and mapped those for each of the colonies. So we know that this grid square falls within the foraging radii of brown noddy, roseate tern, and sooty tern. We know that it falls within the ranges of 17 seabird species, which are scored using different algorithms in terms of their collision risk. So that the lesser frigate bird has the highest collision risk, followed by red-tailed tropic bird, lesser blackback gull, but also scored in terms of displacement, which, as we learned from Samuel, is an equally important risk to seabirds, with some of the tern species being the most impacted by displacement. And then this site also is home to coral reefs. So we pull in data sets on coral reefs, mangrove swamps, seagrasses, mangroves and seagrasses as well. So these key marine habitats could also be incorporated. And again, the sensitivity assessment is made up with a cumulative assessment of the sensitivity of all the species present, combined with the presence of important habitats or important sites or important foraging areas. And again, the hope is that this will help steer, in the first instance, steer development to those areas that seem a lot less sensitive, but also provide an important early warning that can be that areas that are likely to be sensitive, so that effective mitigation measures can then be applied. It's worth pointing out a couple of reasons. A couple of sort of caveats, I suppose. One of the reasons why I showed the map of onshore wind first was because we are able to do these maps. I mean, I think we've come up with a very robust methodology that we can apply around the world in the world's oceans and in regions of pretty low data availability and quality, that still provide really useful assessments that can underpin the expansion of energy. But it has to be said that we can do far more onshore. So onshore, we have a lot more data available, a lot more of actual observation data, which allowed us, one, to refine our maps onshore much more, but also allowed us to have that measurement of how certain we are that the species actually occurs within a grid cell. We don't have observation records out in sea, so we're unable to bring in that element. We also don't have the detailed habitat breakdown. So onshore, we were able to really, break down exactly what the habitat type is, and therefore, ensure that we were weighting biologically rich habitats more than low biodiversity value habitats. Other than being able to bring in certain high value marine ecosystems like coral reefs and seagrasses, we don't have that sort of ability to break down between higher quality marine ecosystem. So the maps that are done for the offshore are of a simpler nature than those onshore, but still I think of a very suitably robust nature, that they can provide a really useful instruction to where would be the more sensible areas in which to kind of progress offshore wind. So with a few minutes left for questions, I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen so that I can answer any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Tris. Indeed, it would much more difficult to design something like this for offshore than onshore. But as you said, we need to start someplace. And our country map for India offshore wind, also the same places lit up, and we had also a place in south of Sri Lanka there for other species. So I do have one question. Maybe a second one just came in, but this one is Jay. Thank you so much for this question. It's on maybe a lot of people's minds. This is from Jay Diffendorfer from the USGS, and he writes, "AV Step is great, Tris. Have you considered trying to include, really hard one here, have you considered trying to include bat distribution data into the tool so one can consider the other half of volant animals impacted by wind? Indeed. I wonder if data
Yeah.
are sparse. Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, no, I mean, I to be honest, I'm often thankful that my remit is still with the birds, and I don't
Exactly.
I've not been paid to look after the bats, because unfortunately it is a lot more difficult for bats. The good thing about birds is we do have very good levels of data. Firstly, we have a good understanding of the birds. We get an increasingly good understanding of which bird species are most impacted, and we can quite understand at quite a good level what are the characteristics that make certain bird species more impacted. There's probably less of an understanding around that about bats, but where we really struggle with bats is having that distributional knowledge to really know exactly where they're occurring. Luckily for birds, particularly on land, but you know, all around the world, there is usually enough data to kind of build up a pretty reasonable picture of where the birds are, certainly for this kind of initial level assessment. And because we have our BirdLife partners in most countries, we can work very closely with them, as we did in these 4 countries, to really help make sure we're putting together all of the data that's out there, and also at every point verifying that data. So we spend a lot of time working with our four partners, looking at these maps and you know, ground truthing it in effect, to make sure we were happy that we're making robust assessments. I think it's difficult with the current data that exists for bats to consider doing that, and where I have been involved in some projects where we have attempted to do that, and we've actually often then incurred some criticism from the bat community that we're sort of going too far, because they often don't think that, you know, these maps can be applied to bats. So I'm conscious that we are missing out a really important part of the natural world that are a really key risk around collision. But I'm also conscious that we can't oversell what can be done for bats, and we shouldn't lose sight of the massive issues that bats face.
Yep. Thank you so much, Tris. Yeah, I think that's just having people continue to raise the issue of bats in these fora is so important. You're talking about mammals, and you're talking about literally thousands and thousands of them being impacted directly by collisions. As back to your question that you mentioned about collision risk. Of course, for offshore wind, we have very little knowledge, but for onshore wind, they are indeed attracted to these turbines, and birds are not. So it's a massive issue to deal with. Talk about nature positive. We need to work on just basic no net loss for those species before we get to nature positive. So I am going to quickly go to 2 more questions here. One is, and then we're going to try to end on time, maybe 3 minutes. Danielle Orrell, similar question. She works in the offshore wind sector in Ireland, and she studies sharks, skates, and rays, lasmobranch. And she asks, would it be possible to integrate a similar, everyone wants the tool, would it be possible to integrate other species classes into the sensitivity maps, e.g. also fishes as additional data layers?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously birds are only one side of the picture. They're one side of the picture in terms of impact, but they're also they're only one of the elements for consideration in siting. So obviously we've included wind resource and also solar resource in terms of where the areas that have sufficient wind and solar, but there are lots of other factors to consider: grid connectivity, topography, you know, all of the other factors. So ideally, you know, I think we as BirdLife will continue to try and use our leading knowledge in birds to accurately map bird sensitivity. But I think, you know, this data can be looked at alongside lots of other data, and just the way that we've brought in other factors that aren't necessarily just about birds, like, you know, coral reefs. You can, if there are other layers of, for example, turtle nesting sites, or certain areas that are known for other marine groups like sharks or marine mammals, they can be brought in, and they can also be brought in alongside those other things that need to be considered. So one would hope that governments will take away our knowledge on the birds, overlay that with the other knowledge they may have on other kind of taxonomic groups, as well as other considerations like shipping lanes and grid connectivity, and use all of this to optimize the level. So definitely we need to be considering all of these things in that strategic planning. We will probably continue to concentrate on doing the bird element, but all of this should be taken into account and can be collectively taken into account in good spatial planning.
So there are 4 other questions, and the good news is that these questions, 5, these questions do lend themselves to being responded to in the chat, because a number of them are quite discrete. So let me just ask one more, and we'll start with Camila's, but then Tris, if you can look at the Q&A and the chat, there's another question for you there, and just respond to those. But let me ask Camila Gotis, and she says, very interesting. Thank you very much. My question, there is no category, it doesn't seem to be a category of no data. Do you have sufficient data for every species to assess and quantify the impact? And sorry if you already explained that.
Yeah, so there are sort of 2 elements to producing a sensitivity map like this. First, you produce a sensitivity index where you score every species in terms of its sensitivity. And we've done work at BirdLife where we've looked at every collision event and also displacement events for birds from the published literature and all the associated grey literature, and then modeled what are the morphological, behavioral, life history traits that make some species likely to collide or be displaced and others not. And doing that, we then extrapolate that to all of the world's birds. So we've come up with an index that says for all of the world's birds how likely they are to be impacted by collision or displacement with offshore wind. So that we can do for all the birds. Then we try and build up as accurate picture of the distribution of those birds as we can, and that's the more the tricky part for offshore wind. And more the risk there is that, you know, we have range maps for all of the world's birds, but these are very generalized range maps. So that, you know, the full extent where that bird could occur rather than necessarily exactly where they are within that, and crucially what the density within that is. We have no way of sort of determining density. So in a way, it's more that our maps kind of overcompensate, which in a way is okay, as they're an early, as they're intended for, you know, at an early precautionary level in the process. So a built-in level of over precaution isn't a bad thing. So it's not so much that, you know, we lack the data. We're built in so in such a way that by lacking data, we're overly precautious rather than we risk being under precautious, if you can see what I mean, and that we generally over model the ranges of species and their presence in that way. So there's certainly a lot of more data that we would need, but I think we're not to refine the maps, but they're refining them from a point of more sort of generalized point. If that answers the question, I hope.
Okay, well, let's do this, Tris. I'm just going to read out loud the questions in brief, and then if you can go to the chat and respond to them. You're welcome, Camila. So Roland Leishi had asked a question regarding challenges of implementing this type of sensitivity map in the European seas. So do you see challenges? He also asked lack of finances or commitment. I think that's a good question. Duncan Lang from ADB asked who funded it and was a big promoter. Without Duncan, we wouldn't have AV STEP. So huge thanks to Duncan and all his work, and to ADB. And he asked Tris, which countries would you like to scale up AV STEP to cover from an offshore perspective? That's a good question. So, Sam Ralston Payton asks, says great work. And very interesting question about have you begun to think about the differences between the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere pelagic birds, right? How that might affect sensitivity scoring, more data, more precision, right? Osama, hi Osama, thank you for joining. Osama Galabi from Egypt says, based on the sensitivity classifications, what is the minimum requirements of data to conduct such classification? So I'll let Tris answer. I think those lend themselves well to a written response, so we don't go too far already over. This is what happens when the facilitator likes the topic. Yes, yeah, start writing them down. I'll go ahead, and I think I'm up now actually, and Rhiannon's going to facilitate this part of the presentation, this part of our program. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and start at this moment, and on the theme of planning, so it fits very well. So I'm going to speak about the World Bank, and thank you so much, Tris. I didn't thank you for your presentation. It was really great. So let me go ahead now. We're going to speak about the World Bank Group's environmental and social, what we're calling framework for offshore wind spatial planning, and a little bit of a diversion in theme here, because we're going to briefly talk about not only biodiversity, but also social. Next slide. So the Offshore Wind Development Program of the World Bank Group, it's actually spearheaded by a group called ESMAP. It's the World Bank's Energy Sector Management Assistance Program. This program is developed, started back in 2019 in partnership with IFC. You know, very broadly, its objectives are to accelerate the adoption of offshore wind in World Bank Group markets, and to ultimately build a pipeline of bankable and sustainable projects. And lots of activities, knowledge exchange, knowledge generation. We developed a series of country roadmaps, which looks at technical, commercial, and also integrates environmental aspects. And importantly, we were able to integrate environmental and social considerations in the entirety of the offshore wind development program, thanks to a grant from ProBlue. Next slide. So see 10 markets listed there, and for the first 7, we have developed or are developing country roadmaps, and a couple of those have been released. Now it's largely looking at some technical and commercial factors, aspects such as supply chain and supporting infrastructure that's needed in the those countries' market considerations, but it also does, we also screened particularly biodiversity sensitivities and highlighted those. Next slide. And in doing our work and in thinking about offshore wind, we know that, and as I had mentioned earlier, it's a considerable acceleration of global growth of this sector, especially we'll see a lot more in emerging market countries. And in these countries that are very keen to develop rapidly, an ESIA process will be insufficient to guide the planning at the sectoral level. And that's often what we're seeing is just an ESIA, and unfortunately, not a very good one. At the same time, larger scale marine spatial planning requires long-term and significant resources and capacity. And the concern here is that it's these processes might not be developed in time for this aggressive rollout of offshore wind. So we identified a need for a pragmatic and a proportionate sector-specific approach to guide at least nearshore spatial wind, near-term spatial wind planning, spatial planning of the sector that could be rolled out at scale. The idea is that this would at least be a precursor to larger strategic environmental assessment, or a precursor to marine spatial planning, or even to be rolled out while these processes are underway, as they could take years. Next slide. So to fill in this gap, we've been developing the environmental and social framework for offshore wind spatial planning, and we call it the ES FOSWAP. The idea is that it provides a conceptual approach to integrating environmental considerations into early stage strategic spatial planning for offshore wind. Now, the purpose is to identify areas where development activities might impact sensitive and biodiversity social receptors, and also where development should be avoided. And it provides a flexible kind of step-by-step practical approach for implementation in any emerging market country to guide the rollout of this sector. And the framework is developed to be tailored to the country context when implemented. The outputs are an environmental map and a social map. And it's importantly, it's designed in alignment with UNESCO's IOC guidance on spatial marine spatial planning. So these things should go hand in hand. Just a brief overview of the product. We start out with, of course, a couple of introductory chapters, goes over why this tool is needed. Chapter 2 provides the ES FOSWAP in brief. If you can't read anything else, you can just read that chapter. It won't tell you how to implement it, but it's enough to that anyone can understand what it is. Chapter 3 goes over commonalities between the environmental framework and the social framework, things like defining the FOSWAP spatial area, or defining the what we call the lead implementer, which could be a government agency or an international consultant supported by the government. It also goes over principles that are common to both frameworks, and indeed the whole process, which is mitigation hierarchy, precautionary principle, human rights-based approach, and these types. Participatory stakeholder engagement is another one. And then it splits out into the environmental framework and the social framework. And of course, we have conclusions in the next step chapter. Next slide. So I just have 2 quick slides here, just illustrative slides, just showing this idea of what we're defining environmental and the ES FOSWAP area. Importantly, what the slide is trying to show is that the FOSWAP area for which this rapid spatial planning should take place would consider both the relevant coastal zone as well as the marine zone, of course, in the exclusive economic zone. And in MSP language, that's considering land and sea interactions. And we really did try to develop this in harmony with these MSP principles. Next slide. And this is just another illustration here. It is limited to the country that would be implementing the FOSWAP. So in an emerging market country, it's unlikely that we're going to get to the extent of regional planning anytime soon, like we have in the North Sea. So it's not so much to be implemented regionally. I mean, if it would, that would be great, but we have to be realistic when we develop these type of endeavors, because we want this to be picked up and implemented by the country. And if it's too ambitious, then it just won't be. So this is meant for a single country approach. It again covers the coastline and also the maritime. Of course, it focuses on the maritime area under national jurisdiction. So the environmental framework and the social framework both center around values, and these are the biodiversity values for the environmental framework. We call it an environmental framework, but it really is entirely focused on biodiversity, as that could be mapped spatially and at the scale we're looking for. And all the usual culprits here. So you have the birds, seabirds and migratory and bats, various types of fish, marine mammals, sea turtles, natural habitats, and legally protected areas and internationally recognized areas. Now, those 2 last bullets there, we use those terms, especially the natural habitat terms. Why do we use them? Because they align with World Bank environmental and social framework and the IFC's performance standards. So the whole idea is that the country would be developing this rapid spatial map, looking at the highest sensitivities, biodiversity and social, And that by doing so, that would be informing the consenting process. And then those developers who are eventually developing these, when they come in, they have some baseline knowledge of environmental and social sensitivities to include in their ESA process, or hopefully avoid some of the areas that are highlighted in red. And we wanted to highlight the biodiversity values that are relevant for the World Bank's ESF and IFC's performance standards. That way, when the developer comes along the line and starts developing their project, they already have information that's relevant to their financier. So this is why we're using some of these terms. Next slide. So the environmental framework takes us through a step-by-step approach, and you'll see this approach mimicked in the social framework, and it's meant to be that way, but it is two separate processes with some dialogue between those processes, especially when we talk about ecosystem services. So we go through step one, which is really desk-based data screening and preliminary activities. You're collating your existing spatial data. You're identifying preliminary biodiversity values. You're establishing what we call a biodiversity advisory group. Step two, although stakeholder engagement really is cross-cutting, we have step two focused on stakeholder engagement. That's when you're convening your biodiversity advisory group to review your findings. This group should have expertise on every single value that's relevant in your FOSWAP area. You're identifying an approach to risk categorization. You're conducting a preliminary risk categorization. And importantly, you're identifying very high-level data gaps. Step three moves into a strategic data collection. We're talking about the whole country here. So we're going to have to use methods that are relevant to large scale. Implementing those field studies in the review and integrating them. And at this point, you're confirming your risk categorization of your biodiversity values. And step four is you're developing a grid-based spatial risk map for each biodiversity value using a GIS system, and then developing a consolidated biodiversity risk map. And then you're taking that back to your relevant stakeholders to validate that. So it's very much an iterative process. In certain countries, they might not have the financing to even do strategic data collection, in-field data collection. In that case, they might go 1, 2, and skip to 4 and save number 3 for another time. At least they'll have something that would be able to feed into their offshore wind spatial planning. Again, this is meant to be rapid, pragmatic, and proportionate to the countries in which we're working. Next slide. So social framework, and we haven't talked about this so much in this webinar, but it's really going to have to be about social inclusivity, right? So biodiversity does go hand in hand with social aspects and even environmental justice aspects when we talk about access to resources for livelihoods. So this framework is quite unique in that we had experts both on the biodiversity side and social and human rights experts and MSP advisor to help us bring these often silos together in one framework. Although it's two separate processes, they're meant to be run in parallel. So there's 4 broad groups of what we call social values, and the broad group of coastal communities, fisheries and aquaculture, marine underwater, cultural heritage, and of course recreation and tourism. And then under each of those groups, you have your social value, and it ranges from coastal municipalities to indigenous people, artisanal and small-scale fisheries. We go into even tangible and intangible cultural heritage. Areas that are important for spiritual reasons have to be considered. And recreation and tourism, of course, tourist attractions and these types of things. So those are our social values. Next slide. And our social framework, then you can see very similar to the environmental framework. So you'll have one lead implementer who is developing, who's kind of overseeing both the environmental and the social framework, running with separate stakeholder groups that would be interacting with each other where necessary, but they're following a similar schematic in terms of their activities. So as I said, for step one, desk-based data screening and preliminary activities. This is more challenging for social aspects. Spatial data, there is some, but there's not as much. You're going to have a more non-spatial data than spatial data, but this is a map, so we do eventually need spatial data. Your stakeholder engagement, especially for the social framework, is extremely important. You're assigning a risk categorization to those values. You don't have the IUCN red list in place, for social values that gives a threat category for certain things. So that is going to be different from place to place, and it's really going to involve transparent and participatory and a representative stakeholder consultation and engagement. So skilled coordination needed here. And we give a lot of guidance on that in the framework. So you're essentially convening your social advisory group to review the data at hand, identify gaps once again, identify approach to risk categorization. It's going to be a little more challenging here. We don't get prescriptive in the framework in terms of how to categorize risk for all of these social values, which can be applicable all over the world. We give more kind of guidance on how it might be done, but it's going to be country specific. And then step three, here's a difference. It doesn't say surveys, does it? Or baseline data collection or something. It says knowledge co-generation. And this is really the term used that it used in MSP and other social sciences. It's different. The idea is that rather than data collection or research, which really is about a specialist going into a community, extracting information, and then that specialist feeding that information to the world, knowledge co-generation acknowledges that this is a collaborative approach to obtain knowledge, and you're really generating the knowledge together. It's not only me as a surveyor extracting it, it's myself as a surveyor or a social scientist working with local communities to generate knowledge together and then decide on how that would be used. So it's different kind of approach, but the idea is that it would be used to fill in gaps. And also in step three, you're going to confirm your risk categorization of the social values. Step four is the risk mapping. Again, you're developing a grid-based spatial map for each social value using GIS, and then you're developing that consolidated risk map. And you're really going to have a lot of stakeholder consultation here, going back to that social advisory group to ensure that they're happy of how that was represented. Next slide. So this is my last slide here, and just some concluding points to say this type of proportionate and pragmatic approach is really going to be important for these countries that have limited resources and capacity and are growing at incredibly fast speeds. And it's going to be important for planning for the avoidance of environmental risk. And we really do keep in mind, it's not only about mitigation, it's also about avoiding these areas. And we have the category of exclusion zones. The approach is strongly collaborative and participatory. It recognizes that key stakeholders identified early on are likely to engage later on. So we want them to be engaged as early as possible. Again, it is compatible with SEA and MSP. Importantly, it helps to ensure alignment with the environmental standards of international financiers, and hopefully increasing the stakeholder acceptance of downstream projects. It will most certainly inform cumulative impacts. It's meant to be used by the government now, so they should be able to see if you're in an area that's lighting up red, that clearly you're going to have more cumulative impacts there. And all in all, this type of work will help accelerate more responsible licensing, reducing permitting risk, and increasing market confidence and hopefully lowering costs. So I'm going to stop there. And thank you for listening. Rhiannon, are there any
hi,
questions?
Thanks, Laurie. Really good presentation. Really great to see this framework coming together. And I've got a couple of questions for you. Our first one, very simple, is where can we get a copy of this framework? People would like to be able to refer to it, so that should be useful if you can share that one.
Yes, and it's not launched yet. I should have said that. So it's been through an external review. Was reviewed by BTO, the British Trust for Ornithology. It was reviewed by BirdLife International, thanks to Tris, and it was reviewed by wildlife expert Martin Perro. It has not, it's right now in the internal peer review in the World Bank group. So we're in the midst of that peer review now. We are hoping, fingers crossed, that we'll be able to launch this at the upcoming Biodiversity COP in Montreal. So it should be ready in December-ish. And once it is, it will be promoted by the CMS ETF. So hopefully soon.
Yeah, no, great, Laurie. Thanks for that update. We'll make sure that we share that with everyone and the ETF when it's ready. And just a quick comment here from Helen Davies in the chat before I go to the other questions is just to mention regional fora that could support offshore wind impact assessments, include regional seas, regional fishery bodies, large marine ecosystems, and regional advisory councils. So they could be useful for you.
Thank you.
Go to one in the Q&A here from Taj. Laurie, very interesting presentation. So important to look at biodiversity and social science together, and we definitely agree with that. As per your experience, how long might it take to apply at a country level? Are you able to share any insights on that?
Yep. It all depends on how long that step 3 takes. So, or even if the country will have the resources to do that step at all. So if you have, let's say, a targeted data service to implement, then maybe I think you can do the FOSWAP in year and a half, probably time frame. Without that step, you're looking at like 9 months if you have a very efficient lead implementer. So it shouldn't take that long, right? Because the whole point of this is that it's rapid. So that's still much quicker than a whole MSP process.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Laurie. And one more here, and from Rachel, just says, hi, it looks like a good framework. Is IFC intending to pilot this in certain countries? And if so, where? What mechanism is there for governments to base decisions on citing and permitting projects on this output? Does it need to be incorporated into legal procedures, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, it would be more the World Bank that pilots it. IFC does do work with governments, and we might be in that position, but it's more the bank, and we'd be doing that through the ESMAP department, and we are doing that in one country already, in Vietnam. We are piloting it before it's finalized, and unfortunately there, and in many places we're going to see this, the country is just ahead. They're licensing these wind farms with no spatial planning. Has nothing to do with ENS either. It's no spatial planning for the sector. So countries are keen to license, and I think what will happen is that we'll be implementing this in parallel. So the short answer though is yes. So right now we're looking at possibly Colombia as another possibility, maybe India. And then the second half of that question, let me see if I can read it myself. Could you repeat that actually?
Yeah, it's in the chat.
That's in the chat. Okay.
Yeah. What mechanism is there for governments to base decisions
right.
on citing projects on this output?
That's a good point. To influence government regulation takes an incredibly long time. When we're working in these countries, we're not always waiting for them to change their regulations. But to change their procedures, yes. So I think the key is to work with the most powerful entity in that government, in the offshore wind space. And that will often be not only the Ministry of Energy, but the utility, the entity that's buying the energy. And what we've done in IFC is by working with the utility, we were able to influence their selection of projects and essentially provide them with a tool. So we haven't thought through, because it's really going to be a country by country process of what is the permitting regulations or consenting regulations in place that need to be influenced. But all in all, I think it's about having, if the World Bank or IFC has the engagement with the government body that has the most power in terms of their decision making and influencing their choices. And we're able to do that if we're in a client engagement with them. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
No, that does. And I think that's really useful. And I can certainly appreciate that, as you say, influencing governments often take a very long time and a lot of effort to do so. So yes, we're now right on time to go to a short refreshment break. So thank you, Laurie, for keeping us right on schedule. And really pleased to hear the excellent questions and comments that are coming in. Please do keep them up. We will be having more presentations shortly. We're just going to a 5-minute refreshment break, and we will be back in 5 minutes time. So feel free to go have a quick break, and we'll be back shortly for the second session of presentations. Thanks,
Rhiannon. I think so, Rhiannon. We answer your question in the chat there. I think we're ready to come back. So welcome back, everyone. Let me put my video on here. There I am. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope that was a little break. And welcome to the new people who have joined us that weren't here in the beginning. I saw some new names in on the participant list, so thank you for joining us. We just got done hearing from Tris Ellison from BirdLife, and we heard from Samuel Warrable from RSPB. And then I also spoke about the World Bank Group's ES-FOSWAP. And now we're going to move on to the second half of the agenda. And the first up, 3 more sessions to go here. And the first up is Jenny Rennell, who's from Escabams. This is going to be an interesting one, waiting for this one on offshore wind and cetaceans and the Escabams mandate. So Jenny, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hope you can see my screen.
Not yet, Jenny.
What about
Oops.
now?
Okay, 1 second. No, we cannot. I can't see the screen.
Okay, let me try again.
Yeah, take your time. There we go. It's coming up now. There we go. And yes. Okay. We can see it.
Okay, great. So, hi everybody. My name is Jenny Rennell. I work in the CMS Secretariat as part of the aquatic species team, but my main job is to coordinate the Escabams agreement. So Escabams is a legally binding treaty of the United Nations administered by UNEP. And you can see the agreement area in the map here, which covers the Baltic, Northeast Atlantic, Irish, and North Seas. And we cover all small whales, dolphins, and porpoises in the area. Our 10 parties are shown in dark green, and 7 non-party range states are in light green. And the Secretariat is based in Bonn, Germany, and shared with the Convention on Migratory Species. So renewable energy, as we've heard, is a necessary component of the efforts to supply the energy needs of human populations while combating climate change. Efforts to harness renewable energy sources, however, should be conducted in a way that does not have a harmful impact on biological diversity and the marine environment. There are potential adverse effects of the ocean energy on small cetaceans from such energy projects. And regarding small cetaceans, this can include potential lethal interactions or injury, negative behavioral impacts from displacement and changes in fecundity, calf survival and juvenile and adult mortality. And there remains uncertainty regarding quantifying the magnitude of the pressure from ocean energy production on small cetaceans. The European Union has renewable energy directive targets, and those are proposed to be amended this year. And it includes identifying go-to areas for renewable energy where no significant environmental impacts are to be expected, and expansion of renewable energy, including required grids and storage, is declared to be an overriding public interest and serving public health and safety when balancing legal interests. And exemptions from nature conservation provisions are then possible. So this is, of course, a bit worrying from the perspective of the small cetaceans we have in European waters. One of the pressures imposed by growing offshore energy construction is impact of fast, noisy service vessels, for example, going 40 knots an hour. And we know that seabirds are reacting strongly to the impact of these vessels, and it is expected that cetaceans are responding similarly. Energy islands, so artificial islands that are created to serve as a hub for offshore wind farms to collect and distribute power. And these locations may clash with prime areas for cetaceans. There was a peer-reviewed scientific paper by Corinna Schrum and colleagues earlier this year in Frontiers Marine Science, where they showed that if you cover the sea with a lot of wind turbines, this leads to wake effects. So you essentially change the temperature and dynamics of the upper layer of the ocean, which potentially large implications of plankton, the food web, including fish and cetaceans. Outside of these threats that I listed here, I will be focusing on underwater noise. And since we weren't able to get a technical expert to present on this, I'd like to share with you a few slides from a presentation by Dr. Tobias Schaffelt, University of Veterinary Medicine, Hanover, given at the 26th meeting of the ASCOBA's Advisory Committee this year. So this is the status in Germany's EEZ in late 2021. The blue areas are already in use for offshore wind energy, and the pale green ones are marine conservation areas. And what you see now are all the areas that can be transferred into offshore wind energy areas in the coming years. And these are color-coded for different priorities. And to show you how crowded this particular EEZ is, here is a map showing overlaid areas for military activities, shipping lanes, but also for sand and gravel extraction. So as you can see, marine spatial planning becomes more and more important. And ASCOBA's is planning to develop draft guidelines for cetacean-friendly MSB during the next 12 months. Regarding key issues of pile driving, when the wind turbine is driven into the seabed, this generates impulsive noise. There are different effects in relation to the distance to the sound source. So in very close distances, we can expect lethal injuries for harbor porpoises, for example. And with further distances, we can still see effects on the hearing, such as hearing impairment. You can see the audiogram of the harbor porpoise, which is quite broad. Hearing is very important to the species. Everything that is above or louder than that green curve you can see can be heard by the harbor porpoise. In case of a loud noise like pile driving, which is shown in red here in this graph, it can happen that the hearing threshold is elevated around the frequency of noise exposure. Over time, the hearing may recover, which is called temporary threshold shift. But if it doesn't recover completely, it is called permanent threshold shift. The definition of hearing impairment, or in case of Germany, the TTS, is important as a management tool because inducing hearing impairment is prohibited by law in Germany. If distance to the sound source increases, we can see behavioral reactions of harbor porpoises. Typical reactions towards pile driving are, for example, porpoises fleeing from the area. What we also see as a reaction to noise source, like ship noise, but it's also true for pile driving, is cessation of foraging activity in harbor porpoises. With increasing distance, we still see some masking effects. Masking occurs when a loud sound drowns out a softer sound, or when noise is at the same frequency as the sound signal. This is of particular concern to marine animals when the noise is at frequencies similar to those of biologically important signals, such as mating calls. Regarding mitigation measures to pile driving, you may know about bubble curtains. So air bubbles are in the water column reflecting the noise, which mitigates the noise emission. However, in the future, with increasing capacity comes increased diameter of the turbines. And this means that the sound pressure levels of the pile driving strikes will necessarily increase as well. Also, with increasing water depth, the big bubble curtain may not be suitable anymore because it's not suitable for deeper waters. Very similar function as the bubble curtains. There's also isolation casings and hydro sound damper. These are different techniques, but in general, these build a curtain around the noise source, reflecting the noise, leading to mitigation. This is an approach of secondarily mitigating noise. There are also primary mitigation tools, such as vibrating pile drivers. So the pile is not driven by the hammer strikes to the seabed, but the piles vibrate into the seabed. This changes the entire noise emission. No high energy impulsive noise, but vibrating more continuous noise. However, less loud doesn't necessarily mean less effect and could also lead to different effects in small cetaceans. There are also some technological developments, such as pulse prolongation by adaptation of hydraulic hammers. So pulse prolongation is achieved by putting an add-on between the hammer and the pile, and the hammer hits on the liquid volume, and this transfers the energy through that volume, which leads to pulse prolongation. And this means the energy is not so high anymore when there are longer pulses. Something similar is achieved by blue piling. So in the blue and red cylinder there happens a controlled explosion in the tank, which is filled with water. And this forces the water to rise and fall down again. And this pushes the wind turbine into the seabed without hammering on it. So we have a different kind of noise source. However, we don't know about the effects of these different noise sources. So maybe we see effects more significant to masking. We need more research on this. Regarding best practices, I just like to quickly show this slide from Dr. Scharfelden. Mentioned that the University of Veterinary Medicine Hanover analyzed the underwater noise recordings of an offshore wind farm in Germany and found a safe distance of 5.6 kilometers. So what does this mean? It means that at the distance of 5.6 kilometers from the noise source, they measured sound pressure level of 145 decibels. And this means that within that area, a temporary threshold shift can be induced by multiple exposure to pile driving strikes, and harbor porpoises must leave that area. It should be noted, however, that a safe distance is not a precise distance, but depends on the sound propagation within the field. Recommendations from the 26th meeting of the Ascoban's Advisory Committee on Ocean Energy encourage parties to monitor population trends of small cetaceans affected by renewable energy sites and to minimize negative impacts on small cetaceans throughout the entire life cycle of offshore wind park operation. The operation phase is 20 to 25 years, so we need to think what happens after that. Another recommendation for parties was to consider adopting common noise thresholds and consider lower noise thresholds for particular species and circumstances for the Ascoban's region, recognizing that temporary threshold shifts should be avoided at all costs. Regulate offshore wind parks so that the disturbance to cetaceans and the threat to ship strikes caused by service operation and other vessels operating in relation to the wind parks is minimized, including speed restrictions and initiating a process to select routes, including outside of marine protected areas. To reach the 2030 targets, it's maybe necessary that multiple wind farms be built at the same time, which hasn't happened very often in the past. And this will put a different stressor on the animals. So effects of multiple wind farm constructions at the same time are unknown. And that leads us to the final recommendation. Plan the coherent development of offshore wind parks across the area in space and time to ensure that populations of stations are not disturbed, their conservation stages and movement patterns are not affected, taking into account cumulative impacts. The advisory committee deemed the issue of recent developments so pressing that it discussed offshore energy again in its meeting this year in September, and agreed that the Secretariat will establish a working group to review the interactions between all forms of marine renewables and small cetaceans, given the considerable current interest in the further rapid development of marine renewables all across the agreement area. The working group would report to the next advisory committee meeting, considering the full range of possible impacts and appropriate mitigations, and seek to establish criteria for identifying areas of high sensitivity for cetaceans, including consideration of their prey and habitats with respect to offshore renewable energy development. Another recommendation was for parties with advice from appropriate experts to identify those areas of high sensitivity for cetaceans. And parties were encouraged to undertake long-term monitoring following the installation of renewable energy devices to assess potential displacement of cetaceans. And encouraged that parties implement all aspects of ASCOBAN's resolution 8.6 on ocean energy as a matter of high priority in light of the recent developments in offshore renewable energy construction. And with that, I'd like to thank you. However, if you allow me, I would like to give the floor to Mark Simmons, who is the CMS COP appointed Councillor for Marine Pollution and also Head of Science in Ocean Care, to kind of give a couple of more slides. Thank you.
Okay, Jenny, just so you're aware, the session is ending in 2 minutes, so we won't have time for questions and answers. We can go a little bit over, but we are just 2 minutes away from the end of the session. But Mark, go ahead.
Thank you, Laurie. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Yes, Jenny asked me a couple of days ago in my capacity as the Councillor for Marine Pollution if I had anything to add to her presentation for you. And I'm afraid what I've got is mainly historical, but it may be of some interest because we were certainly aware of the effects on cetaceans large and small, and there was work looking at this, which I now find incredibly enough was some 10 years ago. So there's still a relatively small number of papers which have been published, which have actually looked very carefully at the effects. And as Jenny has said, concerns have mainly focused around pile drive, the loud noise that comes from putting the wind farms in place. So I'll show you here one of those papers. And then Whale and Dolphin Conservation, which is an international NGO, looked at developments back in 2013 and sort of mapped them all around the world and said we're feeling rather concerned about this, and they brought forward some recommendations. And the slide also shows you a couple of papers produced at around about that time, which started to ask questions about what was going on. And one of those was focused on Scotland and trying to provide advice to Scottish marine renewable developments. And of course, for marine mammals and other marine wildlife, it's not just about marine wind farms, but it's about other developments as well. And from that Scottish paper came a series of potential impacts on cetaceans from different sorts of marine renewable development. And so we've got the pile driving that we've talked about during the construction phase. If you look along the left-hand column, similar problems from other forms of attachment, increased vessel movements with associated pollution risk. And then during operation, we have habitat degradation and individual population displacement and the operational noise, which we don't understand very well. And then we may have also sort of pollution associated during maintenance with anti-fouling releases and again, increased vessel activity. And then there's the issue of decommissioning, which has been certainly quite a hot topic in my part of the world over the years. And so back all those years ago, some advice was given, or we attempted to give some advice to the Scottish government. I think the reason that we're seeing a lot of focus in this meeting on Europe, particularly around the UK, is it's been kind of sort of leading the way in some ways in offshore renewable development. And again, there's a list of things here which the Scottish government might have thought about at that time. But I think if we can now leap forward some 10 years or so to where we are now, everything, of course, is going ahead with great speed. We still don't have a very good knowledge of some issues, including just the distributions and population sizes of marine mammals in many parts of the world, particularly, of course, in the developing world. And we're growing also concerned that as we try to implement marine spatial planning, so marine mammals and other wildlife are responding to climate change by moving their populations, and that's giving us a whole new challenge as well. Anyway, so just a few extra words, and I'll shut up now because I know we're over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark and Jenny. I don't see questions in the chat or the Q&A at this point, but I have a question. I'd like to know, it's a two-part question, really. And the first is, how frequently have you seen offshore wind developers implementing some of the good, or you even showcase best practices for reducing underwater noise? So how prevalent are the implementation of these mitigation measures, if you're aware of that?
This would be a great question for our party focal points, actually.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I don't think Secretariat has that kind of overview.
Okay, no problem.
I think we have a workshop coming up quite soon where that's the kind of question that we'd like to ask, because I don't think we do have
Exactly.
those data.
That's what we need. As you're speaking, I mean, to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this sounds like good practice, or you had best practice as well, but we are talking about mitigation. Would you agree with me if I make the statement that what you're preventing is not net positive? This is just good mitigation measures that everyone should be doing without it counting to net positive. Would you agree with that statement, or do you think this would be considered kind of in the part of the net positive space? Because the two often get discussed together.
I think they go hand in hand. I mean, of course, from Ascoban's Secretariat perspective, this is really looking at the conservation of cetaceans. So wherever there's this offshore wind energy construction going on, we should at least be mitigating all the negative impacts.
Right, mitigating impacts. Mark, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think we've typically come to it from the perspective of CMS and Azkabans in terms of trying to protect the animals and the populations. And I think that's where we are at the moment. Now, if we can broaden out that focus, I think that would be a very good thing. And I look forward to discussions going forward.
Mm-hmm. Very good, thank you. Rob, I see a Q&A and comments in the chat, but very quickly. Okay, Basima, you had asked a question. How can we push for implementing these types of mitigation measures? I'm not sure if Jenny or Mark could respond to that one. So how can we push for implementing these types of mitigation measures? I guess, how can we encourage wider adoption of them?
Well, in the CMS and Azkaban's mechanism as a UN agency is for the parties to agree on these mitigation measures, right, through conference of parties, through meetings of parties. So that's one way of doing it. And of course, raising awareness. Right.
So the first step is to get the governments on board through their how many signatories do you have to Azkaban's?
10.
Okay, so we need more. It's a very important topic.
This is also an issue for the Mother Convention for CMS. How many CMS parties do we have? Yeah.
133.
Okay,
There you
getting
go.
better.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This is a key topic. I noticed that, I don't know if Robert, I see you're still here. Robert, the gem check from ABRD. And I don't know, maybe this is the time that you wanted to make your comment earlier. Yes, go ahead, Robert. And then I'm going to quickly jump to the next speaker.
Hi, Laurie and everybody. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Great. So I think going back to the same question I had in the first session is the view. I think this is fundamental view. What is no net loss and what should be compliance and what we should be aiming as not just best practice, but normal practice versus going beyond and saying it's net positive. It is a very important area because I can see that there will be some financial institutions, but also some people, even among the IFI world, will try to label everything as positive investment when it's compliance. And I think, and then it will actually undo some of the good things we're doing, because I think there should be minimum standards, minimum approach. It's also a difference between some of the jurisdictions we work in versus European, sort of, which is more, I wouldn't say control and command, but it is more formalized in terms of yes and no's, versus the we could say Anglo-Saxon, the US, the UK, which is more done on sort of best practice basis, and there's a case law and everything else. It's different even in legal systems. So I think this is going to be an important area for us to decide and to clearly state what is compliance, no net loss, and what is above, because it will start to skew some of the project finance. It will also look at how people greenwish or greenwash some of the things that are being done. And I'd like to avoid that and avoid those such discussions in the longer term, because I think we should make sure that in terms of protection of nature, it's a fundamental compliance issue, and we should have minimum, the more you could say minimum standards, the better, and a general consensus that we can compare apples with apples. Because otherwise we're going to be comparing projects where one is saying it's compliance, the other one is saying it's net positive, and counting it in a different pot, and for their institution as being better than another institution, just on the basis of how they put the apples and pears together in different pots and different pans, and it's the same stuff, and in fact we're still protecting, but it will create problems, and will also create problems for us, like myself and Laurie working on various things. Which projects will be classified in what way? So I think that's a question for me, quite important, because there's a lot of emphasis on nature positive, natural capital, but in nature there is, I think, the net positive in many countries, and particularly where we're going to have offshore, is going to be more in the developed world for the first areas, or sort of the OECD countries, and therefore the protection and laws are different. Then if I'm going to go somewhere else outside these more areas where they have lesser regulatory controls and systems in place.
Robert, thank you so much. I think that very question should be the topic of a webinar. Robert, as you were speaking, you're getting several thumbs up. I would have given you the thumbs up as well. Jenny and Mark, we're going to move to the next speaker. So did you want to quickly respond to what Robert was saying before? Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much, and Laurie, look forward to seeing you as well soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to maybe one more comment on what Robert was saying. It really is a fundamental question. What was being presented just now is totally in the remit of the developer themselves, how they mitigate underwater noise. I can't see any way that could be made into a nature positive argument. That's talking about compliance. And we really do have to be careful about this, because in the past, up until 2 years ago, everything that were a good international industry practice or minimization of impact or striving for no net loss was considered basic. That's what everyone was striving to. That was compliance. There were no extra points there to be gained and the nature positive. Now, if we're considering this nature positive, all of a sudden basic compliance somehow becomes something special. And I think we heard earlier from Samuel that he made a nice distinction about nature positive. It was the first time I ever heard that, was really to say, look, that's when you're talking about broader strategies, and maybe you're also talking about collaboration with other sectors. That could be really interesting space to explore it for as nature positive, way above and beyond compliance. But I think Robert's question is really the hot one for this day and age, and not one that many people are asking, and I think we need to. So with that in mind, I am going to pass on to the next speaker, and that is Kadla Freund, and she will be speaking from an NGO perspective. She'll be presenting the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, and it's called the Ocean Coalition. So I'll turn it over to you, Kadla. I'm sorry, Carla, running a bit over now, but I'll pass it over to you.
I'll try and make up the time. Let me just share my screen here. Can you see my presentation? I can't actually.
We can see it. We also see
okay.
a little bit of your screen though. There's
okay.
There is Explorer up or something. There we go. Okay.
Are you seeing the presenter view or the?
Yeah, we're seeing the presenter view. Not the
So-
presenter view, the actual,
okay.
the view you should be showing us.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Carla Freund. I work for the German BirdLife partner NABU on energy transition topics, and through that I am sort of representing them in the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. Right off the bat, I need to say I can't speak for the coalition as a whole. I can only speak for my own organization, and then I also represent BirdLife Europe at times, and other members of the BirdLife partners, other partners are also members in the Offshore Coalition, for example, RSPB, who you heard speak before. And in the Mediterranean offshoot of the coalition, we have the Spanish BirdLife partner and the Italian BirdLife partner also being part of this coalition. So, right, I'm going to give you sort of talking a little bit about why this coalition even exists, or from an NGO perspective, why we want to work on offshore wind. So looking at targets and trends of offshore wind, BirdLife commitments to this topic of the energy transition and offshore wind in particular. Just a really short overview of the state of our oceans. We heard from Samuel, we know how bad the state of our oceans is. We want to look at what the opportunities here are. And then looking at what is the Offshore Coalition of Energy Nature, the structure, the priorities from NGO side, and the current publications that sort of we've done together in this coalition. So why do we need offshore wind? We need offshore wind to achieve net zero. I mean, it was also highlighted earlier that there's more to it than just producing renewable energy. There's obviously the production side, but I'll leave that out for now. The offshore renewable energy strategy from the European EU, from the European Commission, indicated that they want to achieve 300 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2050. This was a number that was published before the new renewable energy targets were being discussed, and that number might even be higher now, although it's still, for offshore wind, it's still 300 gigawatts. And then from a German perspective, the German government has announced it wants to achieve 70 gigawatts of offshore in the German economic zone by 2045. And I think achieving sort of an extra 10 gigawatts in the next by 2025. So that's quite a lot of growth in the sector. To the right, you can see the graph from Wind Europe on the growth of offshore wind. So right now we're producing around 22.5 cumulative installed capacity in European waters. And most of that, as you can see, is in the UK and in Germany. And for Germany, I have to highlight that is a very huge target if you're considering that the German economic zone is quite a bit smaller. The offshore zone is quite a bit smaller than, for example, the one of the UK. So how does BirdLife show that it's committed to also to the development, to the offshore wind development? We are involved in developing EU guidance documents for EU guidance documents and for Berne Convention documents, for example, on sensitivity mapping, and so how it can be used to making better siting choices. We're part of this Convention of Migratory Species, Energy Taskforce, and then the kind of crux of this whole talk, the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature. Right, so the state of our oceans, we know that the objective from the Marine Strategy Framework Directive was to achieve good environmental status of EU marine waters by 2020. This was obviously not achieved. And we know that offshore wind will have a biodiversity impact. For birds, this is collision, displacement, and barrier effect risks. We've heard more about marine mammals just earlier. And only 11% of our seas are currently protected versus 26% of land. So marine protection is still lagging behind sort of on land protection. And they don't just need to, so these protected areas don't just need to be protected, they also need to be managed. There needs to be quantified conservation objectives and appropriately monitored to make sure that the conservation goals are being achieved. I think there's been some studies on protected areas and how basically only 0.3% of them are being properly managed and monitored. So far they represent more paper parks than they do actual protected areas, with lots of harmful activities still taking place in them. And we know that there's going to be a cumulative effect of adding offshore wind onto all the other pressures that already take part in our ocean. So that's just a short overview. So on the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, it's a coalition of NGOs, wind industry, and transmission system operators, TSOs. So those are the grid developers. And it's a coalition where we've joined forces to cooperate on the sustainable deployment of offshore wind energy and infrastructure. And while ensuring alignment with nature protection and healthy marine ecosystems. I think this is really important, the alignment with nature protection, because as was highlighted also in the talk before me, there's some new sort of developments on EU level for renewable energy that really sort of have renewable energy targets be a risk to nature protection. And we know that we can only achieve a truly sort of sustainable and holistic transition to net zero if we protect nature, because nature is also our #1 ally in the fight against climate change. So we can't have one or the other, we need to have both. And BirdLife has been was involved in founding this group together with RSPB and RGI. We saw from the offshore development targets and how much we already have is that the UK has always had significantly more. So they've already observed the effects that a large and fast increase of offshore wind can have on the marine area. And we've noticed that, we need to work together with the wind industry to be able to tackle these things, especially when it comes to deregulation attempts to nature protection. And then also on the flip side, being able to have a fast energy transition, so that we have a chance of limiting global warmth to 1.5 degrees. So the current work areas, focus areas of the group are marine spatial planning. So this we see as a huge priority because it's the #1 thing we can do to avoid impacts is to properly site and plan. To not put offshore wind farms in very sensitive areas. And then data centralization. We know we can't we can't wait until we have all the data and all the information to expand offshore wind. Development will happen, but there is a significant amount of data that we already have However, it is not always available to everyone, and it's sort of centralized in different areas across different member states of the EU. So from our side, it's also very important to make sure that data is accessible so that we can make smarter choices. Then auctioning process and sustainability criteria in that auctioning process. So when developers bid for sort of building rights in an area, so far the auctioning process only really includes economic criteria. However, there's efforts in, for example, the Netherlands to include sustainability criteria in this auctioning process. And that can also sort of be a way to maybe increase the uptake, for example, of these mitigation measures that were mentioned before, and have that process to be used in other European countries as well, and not just limited to one place. And then, yeah, restoration. So we need to move beyond just simply protecting the few areas that we still have left. We also need to restore them. So from our priorities within ocean, I mean, I mentioned sort of what the group is focusing on right now, but our priorities are indeed using the marine spatial planning process to achieve good environmental status for our oceans and speeding up development of offshore wind to tackle climate and the energy crisis. On the top right, you can see sort of a density map of vessel traffic. So you can see the North Sea is a very highly used place. And there certainly isn't enough space to be able to accommodate all the uses we have now, plus on top of that also offshore wind. So we're going to have to, one, have really smart planning, and two, also reduce some of the pressures that exist so we can prioritize nature protection and offshore wind to a certain extent. And then also within this group, we advocate for the use of sensitivity maps with wind developers to make better siting choices. Yeah, Therese is definitely doing really great work on that across the world. And so we'd like to replicate some of that in Europe. And then, yeah, nature restoration, sort of moving from a passive to an active conservation agenda, because simply protecting what we still have will not be enough. Yeah, we need to expand the areas that for the sake of the environment, but also so that they can function as carbon sinks. If we sacrifice those for the sake of offshore wind, then we won't be able to achieve the energy transition as a whole. So within these topics, we've already done some work together in this coalition. For example, we've just recently published, so Ocean has recently published 10 recommendations how to improve marine spatial planning to reach European climate and energy and biodiversity targets. Independently from this, BirdLife and some partners and WWF so they've done it independently. We did an evaluation also of MSPs, and basically they're insufficient in almost all criteria. Some of the criteria are sort of an ecosystem-based approach, cross-border collaboration, stakeholder consultation, etc. And then some member states haven't even yet submitted their MSPs, even though they've been due. And this sort of guidance document, or these recommendations, were developed together with wind industry, and hopefully that the member states that need to rework their plans and those that have not published yet can use this document to be able to implement a better marine spatial plan. Some of the recommendations include, for example, an ecosystem-based approach, transboundary communication, because we know that these problems won't be solved in our own four walls. We need to look beyond our own boundaries. So to be able to, one, also have, to be able to look at the whole ecosystem rather than just what's happening within our own or a member state's own sort of boundaries. And then, for example, sharing marine spatial plan data so others can make better choices. And then, for example, collecting marine data continuously to make adaptive decisions. So those are just a few of the recommendations. I encourage you to look at the full document if you want to hear all of them. Another document was Ocean Statement as on improved, robust, and timely MSP process. This also has to do with sort of the development of these go-to areas, and rather than just drawing these on a map, using the existing marine spatial planning process to be able to identify areas where offshore wind will have less impact and also be able to create space for nature. Again, highlighting that nature is our greatest ally in the fight against climate change. And then the last document is data monitoring, is the case study on the Belgian example on data monitoring and centralization, where instead of being in developers' hands, it's being taken over by a scientific body and that data being centralized so that everyone has access. There are other groups, for example, EMODNet, that does a great job of collecting marine data, but this can definitely improved. This can definitely be improved. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Carla. That was a great presentation. And I especially liked how you emphasized repeatedly that there needs to be a fully functioning ecosystem in place to establish and ensure that those oceans remain carbon sinks. Now we do have one question, but I think we have to jump to our next presenter because we're supposed to be finishing up our webinar in a half hour, and we still have another presentation to go. What I will do is still read the question here, if you can answer it in the chat. And also, Carla, could you also put in the chat the link to that document?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. So the question from Adma Halsa is, regional approaches to wildlife monitoring and research needs are centralized, and public databases are key for assessing cumulative impacts and lowering costs for developers, efficiencies between developers, and lowering redundancies. Good examples of this are in the UK and the US. How do we expand this approach to developing countries? So it's a big question, and I will just let you share some thoughts in the chat. And sorry, Adma, we can't discuss it further. But I'm going to move on at this moment to Heike Wilson-Mesa, who's from the Spanish Wind Energy Association. And she's going to speak about advancing nature, safe, renewable energy in Spain. Thank you so much, Heike. Oh, yes.
Well, it happens a lot. It's a Finnish name, and it's actually a male name.
Okay,
but,
sorry. We did identify as a Finnish name, though.
No problem. It happens to me all the time. So it's,
okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. And Spain has been a leader in onshore wind energy. So really interested in what you have to say. So I'll leave it up to you.
Okay, so let me see if can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. And if you could just put that on, just blow that up so it fills up the screen.
Okay.
There we go.
It's okay now?
Oh, not yet.
Not yet.
Okay, there it is. There we go. Okay, thank you so much.
Perfect. Well, actually, it's quite a pleasure to be with you today. Not as much as I have to say. I hope it's going to be interesting, but also because I learned a lot listening to the previous presentations. As you were saying, Spain has been one of the forerunners in the development of onshore wind in Europe, and actually we have learned a lot during the last 25 years of development of wind on how we can make biodiversity and the wind coexist. Not, of course, everything can be improved. We are well aware of that, and we are all the time. Our companies, especially those that are in the business of preventing bird fatalities. We have a lot of them working on that area, are always trying to come up with better solutions. But of course, it's not just a technological matter. There are many other issues that have to be taken into consideration when you are speaking about the protection of biodiversity. Today, I would just like to give you a few ideas about what is the situation of biodiversity protection and wind in Spain, Also, what is the situation with offshore development, wind offshore development in Spain, and what is to be expected in the near future, and where are the question marks, and well, a little bit of the details of what it's being done at the moment for the maritime spatial planning. So just to give you a few ideas, Spain is, as you probably know, is one of the big guardians of European biodiversity. There are so many species that are have a very important refuge in the Spanish, and not only in Spain and also Portugal, but in the Spanish geography. And it's so very important that the Spanish government has declared 27% of the land area of Spain is Natura 2000 areas, which means from a practical point of view, there is no development of wind farms in those areas. Also, from the point of view of marine surface that is protected, is the second country in Europe, only after, as you can see in the map, is France, that it has a bigger area that is protected. And it's also the first country in protected area for birds, which is about 20% of the whole area of Spain is declared as cepas, which means that these are protected areas for birds. So you can imagine we have learned during this, as I was saying, these 25 last years of development of wind farms. We have over 1,200 wind farms that have undergone the environmental impact assessment, which is it's compulsory for any wind farm in Spain. And that means that we have learned a lot of what is okay and what is not okay when you have to do a wind farm. Sometimes people think that an environmental impact assessment, when you start it, you know that it's going to be positive and you can build your wind farm anytime you start this kind of process to the environmental permitting. And that is absolutely far away from true. Actually, at the moment, we have a situation where 1 in 3 or maybe 1 in 4 of the projects that are submitted to environmental impact assessments are approved, or approved without conditioning, or conditions that are so hard that it is impossible and it doesn't make sense economically to do the wind farm. So this is something that sometimes when we discuss, especially when you go to discuss with local associations at local level, and they think that there's going to be swamped by tens or hundreds of wind farms because they are just being projected onto the territory. That's not going to be true, because the situation actually is that there are most of them will not actually become wind farms. As you can see in the slide, the protection areas, besides the Natura 2000 areas, which are on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, you have important bird areas, which also have a degree of protection, and which have to be taken into consideration when you want to do a wind farm and you submit it for environmental impact assessment. So it's quite difficult to find a spot actually where there is no far away, actually, because from protected areas. And you can see here on the left-hand side, you can see a map of the northern part of Galicia, where all the spots that are dark orange are spots that the area which is dark orange, you cannot build wind farms on them. And you can see on the right-hand side, you can see where the actual wind is, the resource. I put this because it's important to understand that wind is not like solar PV. You cannot not do it anywhere. You have to do it when there is a resource. Otherwise, there is no economical point in doing it. But having said that, of course, you have to the legislation and also the good practices of the sector obliged to do, of course, to try to do the projects in the most benign or less environmental impact on biodiversity. So this map that we have here in Spain actually is quite has a lot of how you say it, different levels of establishes the level of sensitivity of each area, and guides very much where the wind farms can be actually sited. And that leaves us a very quite a small area where actual wind farms can be developed. But this is okay. I mean, the sector accepted the situation because it is, as I was saying at the beginning, it's very important that biodiversity is preserved, especially when we have so many species that are of quite a lot of value, not only for us, but for the whole of Europe, because we, as you know, we are in Spain, many species emigrate through Spain from North Africa to Northern Europe and back and forth. So it is very important that we coexist and we try to do our best to improve the situation, not just keep it as it is, but even improve it. So when it comes to offshore, that was the situation with onshore. When it comes to offshore, it is for us is a completely new adventure, in the sense that we have, as I said, 25 years of experience in onshore, sorry. And but in offshore, we actually Spain was trying to develop its first offshore wind farms 15 years ago, but the crisis came and it became less interesting to develop these more costly projects, especially at the time. And so the idea was to concentrate on onshore, where there was still room for more capacity to be built. So, but in 2021, the government has issued the offshore wind energy roadmap with for 2030. We have a specific objective of 1 to 3 gigawatts. There's needs, it's coordinated with the transmission grid planning, and the initial deployment for, let's say, so-called almost commercial offshore wind farms or pioneering wind farms it's expected to be in the Canary Islands. And in order to award, to make them possible, a tender framework is going to be proposed. And there are some funds also available from EU funds, from the Recovery, Transformation and Resilience Plan. So there is a certain urgency to be able to start using these funds in order not to lose them. But on the other hand, there are some negative points, especially for the companies that want to work on this area, because there is not much visibility on when the auction is going to take place. Although we have been told that it's going to be in the beginning of next year, maybe in the first half. Here, a word of caution that the auction, when we talk about an auction taking place, it can mean that maybe the wind farm the offshore wind farm has to be connected to the grid in 5 to 6 years. So it's a long time gap between the auction and the actual connection of the wind farm. We don't have long-term targets for the moment, but we expect them to be approved maybe next year. And the regulatory framework in order to do the permitting for offshore wind farms is obsolete. It was from the previous era, and so it's not actually being used. Has been derogated, and a new one is going to be approved in next year. We expect to see a draft at the beginning in December. So, well, this is more or less the situation from a let's say political perspective. When it comes to the actual steps that we need to see before we actually have projects in the water, well, as you have been discussing also, we need first to have a maritime spatial planning, which is being done. We have already a draft. I showed you some of the areas that have been selected. And in this planning, of course, we need to be very careful with the depths, because of course it determines not just the cost of the technology, but also the kind of technology that has to be used, because with the big depths, you will have to start using floating wind solutions. And that is a different technology from the one that has been used in the North Sea. So we have to take also into consideration, as I was saying before, the availability of wind resources. We have to take into consideration, the government, especially when doing this planning, protected areas from a biodiversity point of view. And also, and very important, also from a social point of view, is the compatibility with other activities. And that's a first level. But then, of course, once you go to the next step for the actual materialization of the projects, you need to have an auction where you're going to put companies to compete for a certain area that has been identified in the previous step. And then you will have to take into considerations other issues, not just the price, but also industrial developments, and what is going to be the relationship with the fisheries, how you engage with the society at local level, etc., etc. And once you go, and well, actually, normally it goes in tandem with this step. You need to start doing your project. And in this project, you will have to do an environmental impact assessment, which is quite a long process. If onshore, it can be 1 year just to do the bird studies. Here we are talking about 1.5, and it can be even 2 years to do all the studies that are required. We'll see some of the details later. But it has, once you put the project on the water and at project level, then all the details have to be perfect, and there is no way you can make shortcuts when it comes to get the approval, the environmental approval. And in our experience from onshore, especially in the last 5 years, you better have a very good project from the beginning, or otherwise it's going to be very difficult. Very good project in terms of having all the assessments and all the studies done properly, or otherwise your project is going to be doomed from the beginning. So in the wind energy areas that have been identified, you can see in the map. We have 5 development zones, of which there are wind energy areas in 4 of them. In the Galician and then Atlantic, you have one, and the Mediterranean, you have Eastern Mediterranean, you have one, and the South Mediterranean, you have another one, and in the Canary Islands, you have another one. In the map, you can, on the right-hand side, you can see what is the resource in each of these areas. So you can imagine that in the Gibraltar Strait, there is a lot of wind, but of course, it's very difficult to actually have projects there, because it's a very busy area with all types of activities, not just vessels going back and forth, but also tourism, etc., etc. But in total, the areas that have been identified in the draft, they sum up 8,000 square kilometers, and they actually only occupy about 0.7% of Spanish water, so it's not like a huge amount of space that is occupied by the proposed areas. So the criteria, as I was saying, the main criteria that has been taken into consideration is the depth. So according to the criteria that have been used, they are so far away from coast. The areas identified that the depth is quite high, so only floating offshore wind will be available as a technology for this development, which has its implications also from an environmental point of view. The wind resource in the areas has to be higher than 9 meters per second as an average per year. So, and it has to be outside. Of course, these areas are outside both existing and future environmental protected areas, and have to coexist with other activities like defense, which is quite huge in some parts of the coast, fishing, which is very, very important activity in Spain. It's the second biggest fleet, has the second biggest fleet of the world for fishing. Also agriculture, maritime traffic, which is, as I was saying, for instance, in the Gibraltar Strait is quite important issue, and other research and development issues. So it's a rather difficult. I'm not really don't envy so much the Ministry of an ecological transition. It's a lot of work, a lot of data that has to be put together, and actually try to make it work so that everybody has a little space in the water. For us, of course, it's difficult because we are the wind, offshore wind is difficult because it's the last, let's say, the last guy in the area, so in town. So it's going to be. We have, as a sector, we understand that as the last one that are coming into these areas, we are the ones that will be under the spotlight. So we have to be very careful and do things right from the beginning. So of course, in the maritime spatial planning criteria, there are some priorities. I mean, once you have been allocated an area, you have certain, let's say, so-called rights. I mean, once you have been allocated the area, nobody else will be allocated, for instance, the same area for other activities which are not related, or you will be able to connect your wind farm to the grid without major problems. So you have certain rights, but of course you will have also certain obligations. So you will be asked to occupy the least possible marine space. You have to identify those fishing or aquaculture activities that could coexist with a wind farm in order to make it, to make a better use of the space. Also, identify the types of vessels that could navigate within the field for commercial exploitation, and the permeability of offshore wind priority areas must be facilitated so that, for instance, transit of vessels or fishing fleet, if possible, can come through the offshore installations. And also the electricity, the evacuation installations, the cables and other infrastructure necessary to inject the electricity from the wind farm, offshore wind farm, to the grid will have to occupy the smallest available marine space. So, as I was saying from the beginning, in this maritime spatial planning, the areas of interest for biodiversity are taken into consideration. So it's you have actually no-go areas in the Spanish coast, but from the beginning.
So sorry to interrupt, Heike, but just so you're aware, we have 6 more minutes before the end of the webinar. So you're just getting to the question I was going to ask you, though. So feel free to continue, but we do have to end in about a minute.
So I will finish fast. So in the next step, once you have been allocated the area, you have to do the permitting, and there you have the environmental impact assessment, all the studies you can see there, and even more depending on what the specific requirements from due to the specificities at local level. So it's very, very long and very exhaustive process. So what I wanted to also to underline is that in Spain we will not have a bottom fixed technology. We will have only floating technology, which is quite new, and therefore I was saying it's important for us to learn on what has been said from before, but also it's a new challenge to understand what are the environmental effects of this technology, which has only, for the moment, only 2 commercial wind farms operating in the world. And you can see that the project design criteria are quite, I mean, these machines are very big, but they are floating, not fixed onto the bottom. And they are quite, of course, taking into consideration birds. They have these are very big machines, and they have a blade radius between 120 and 135 meters in total. And well, these are just to make you see how big these wind farms can be. I want also to mention a little bit that we have had quite from the beginning, not us, but the government also, quite a strong opposition from the fishing sector, which is normal. I mean, we are going to occupy part of their area that they are currently using. But the real experience with fisheries is that at least from the one wind farm that is in Portugal, the floating offshore wind farm, is that the fishing captures actually in the nearby fish areas have remained the same even after the ban on fishing in this offshore floating wind offshore in Portugal, or have increased in for several species because it becomes a safe haven for them. Well, having said that, we expect, as I was saying, to have this the maritime spatial planning to be approved during this November, December, and to have the regulatory framework ready for the permitting by the beginning of the year, and the first tender and also in the first half of the year. But again, we don't know which ones of these zones will be developed. For the moment, we expect it to be Canary Islands, but again, it's something that needs to be seen. Having said that, I thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we can learn a lot, especially us, from how to do things the best possible way.
Thanks so much. Well, you certainly were able to encapsulate the complexity of this space. I mean, we're talking about biodiversity here, but there's an enormous number of other factors that need to be considered at the same time, which takes us back again keeps taking us back again to the importance of spatial planning in the face of the rapidity of the rollout of this sector. So we can't see enough of that. The good thing is that everyone seems to be saying the same thing, from NGOs to the convention, the CMS convention itself, to the Energy Association, to the financiers. So I think that's the positive note. So thank you so much. I am going to, at this point in time, we are due to end the webinar. I want to thank all the presenters. I think the more that we can share tools in the space and make them available to other markets, so those other markets, those new and emerging markets in the space, could learn from more developed markets and eventually develop really country-specific approaches to responding to this issue as quickly as possible. Before we end, though, we're going to turn to Ivan Ramirez from the CMS, who's going to say a couple of closing words.
Thank you very much, Lori, and thank you to all the speakers. I think it's been great to hear about so many developments, and I just feel sorry that we didn't have enough time for questions. I'm sure that many people have got questions. I actually had some of my own, but I think it's, for the sake of time, it's better not to. So just one minor remark from my part. I think that, the fact that we have discussed this issue here is in part thanks to the great work that different stakeholders are doing in this topic, but also because of the ETF itself. So probably the last call that I would like to make is on that regard. The Energy Taskforce, as I said, is a multi-stakeholder platform. Is about bringing together NGOs and associations and corporates and academia and MEAs and financiers. And it was great to have the opportunity to discuss this. It was also really good to hear about other species, not just birds, and also bats and others were mentioned. The CMS, I insist, is not just about birds, but about all migratory species. So make sure that you reach out for the CMS or to BirdLife as the coordinator of the ETF to become members, to become observers, to hear about the next steps. We have been organizing webinars all along this year. More will come for sure. We have a very ambitious plan of work for the next months to deliver, and of course also more meetings, and including in-person meetings hopefully for next year. So the door is open for all of you to share also your best practice and to share your ideas for how to address the gaps that we identified here. From our side, specifically from the CMS, definitely we will continue to work with the governments to make sure that also they engage. And one thing that I think is quite important, that they have and they allocate enough time for the discussion to happen, and for especially the co-decision to happen. So thanks again to all the participants for a great workshop. Over to you, Laurie.
Thank you from me as well, everyone. I think we're going to close on time. So have a good rest of the day and or evening. Thank you so much.